Story number 1. I promised myself I'd never talk about that drive again. But silence has a way of breeding echoes, and mine have learned my name. I know highways look honest under sunlight. At midnight, they start telling the truth. I'm an adjuster by trade and a skeptic by habit. Numbers, timelines, angles, and still, that night revised my math for what belongs in a car. There's a perfume I can't wash out of my upholstery. It clung to the foam as if scent could learn to grip. If you're reading this at night, lock your doors if it helps you breathe. But it won't help her. I make my living walking backward through disasters until the story snaps into place. The cases pay my rent and keep my shelves stocked with the kinds of folders that fray at the edges. They do not make me superstitious. The night I left the casinos and sodium lamps of Reno behind, I believed in lane lines, maintenance schedules, and the comfort of a friend that expects me home. The desert greeted me with its usual refusal. No trees, no roofs, just a road like a drawn-out thought refusing to end. The sky had no moon to teach the asphalt silver, only a dark that felt active, like it was erasing as it went. I set the cruise, eased my grip, and let a faraway radio station rummage through old vinyl. My name is Kobe. It's something I sometimes say out loud on long drives, to remind the cabin that it contains a person. The first time I noticed her, I didn't trust my eyes. I first saw her in my rear-view mirror, 50 yards back, dead center of the lane, motionless, the way a photograph forgets to breathe. An elderly woman in what looked like a faded blue dress. One arm lifted, not waving, not warning, just requesting entry into my night. I've pulled over for strangers before. It's part kindness, part curiosity. You never know which accident will introduce itself. But the scene had no props, no car, no hazard lights, no debris that a story could attach to. She didn't diminish, right? Distance should weather a figure. She remained complete, like she was standing inside my taillights instead of under them. When I reversed with the hazards on, the road returned to what it prefers to be. Just empty asphalt stretching into the darkness. I told myself what drivers tell themselves: fatigue, hypnotic stripes, the brain inserting a person where a shadow slouched. 15 miles is enough time to talk yourself out of fear. It wasn't enough time to prepare for her to be back. The same powder blue dress, the same lifted arm, the same refusal to obey the rules of getting smaller. This time, her gaze made the mirror feel like a window. I've interviewed people on the worst day of their lives. I know hunger when I see it, and desperation when it wears a shape. Her eyes were looking directly at me through the mirror. The message I read there did not ask for help. It anticipated arrival. I stopped again. Because habit is a kind of faith. Door unlocked, engine running, breath burning its own path in the cold air. My flashlight carved a weak column and found nothing to reward it. No prints, no heat, no proof that the night had borrowed a person for a minute. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It arranged itself around my heart and waited to be believed. The third time, I did not stop. I just kept driving, and she approved. She moved closer for my trouble. Space started to fail basic tests. Her dress declared details my headlights hadn't earned. White flowers, like small coins scattered across old blue, hair arranged in victory rolls from a decade that felt stitched shut. By the fourth sighting, she was close enough that I could make out details, and the details felt chosen for me. When my attention drifted to the mirror, reality punished the lapse. She adjusted instantly, consuming distance without movement, like a photograph enlarging itself. She was now maybe 20 yards behind the car, and the gap wasn't a gap. It was an intention. Her mouth was shaped in a sound I could not hear, a speech bubble without lettering. Her hand stayed extended, not asking for a ride anymore, but reaching, measuring whether the cabin would surrender under pressure. The steering wheel cooled under my palms. Numbers tried to help. 80, 90, 100. But numbers were scenery to her. It was like she existed in a bubble of space that moved with my car. I'd like to tell you, I held my lane, and my breath, and my disbelief. That would be a false report. When she joined me, it was not an entrance, but an edit. The passenger seat remembered her and declared her present. The powder blue dress folded into place. The fingers, that was the part my body refuses to forget. Too long, too pale, as if the hand had been stretched by the need to touch. A combination of old perfume and something else. Water locked too long with wilted flowers, climbed into my throat and sat there. She turned. The eyes were not eyes. They were a pair of negations, dark enough to swallow the question of where their light should have been. I've taken statements from people whose voices learned new shapes under pressure, and now my own learned one. The shoulder received me hard. Gravel skittered beneath tires, and then the car steadied. I stared at the seat, where her weight had felt inevitable, and she wasn't there, leaving behind only the lingering scent of old perfume and the unmistakable impression in the seat cushion. The cabin became a classroom for air. I listened to it until the edge of dawn offered credit. The rest of the drive did not punish me further. I left the windows cracked, not because of temperature, but because the inside of the car had become too complete. In daylight, terror looks like a story you once heard, but never told well. I tried to file the night in my head the way I filed collisions. Photos, times, maps. Close the folder. But it wasn't over. My job teaches a person that answers like to hide in paper. The library welcomed me with the dry smell of pages that have decided to last. Police records contributed their iron language. The name arrived like something you realize you've been expecting. In 1967, a woman named Dorothy Henshaw. The summary had all the ingredients I'd denied the night. Breakdown, distance, driver who kept going. The photograph printed the truth I had already carried. The powder blue dress. Her silver hair styled in victory rolls. An arm raised one last time to be seen. Her body was found 20 yards from her disabled vehicle. One arm extended, case closed. Case never closed. Paper can do both. Reports logged calls over the years. A woman on the highway at night. Officers dispatched to find an absence. The map I carry inside me now includes a blue route that moves when I do. I have driven that route once after, in clear daylight, with a colleague filling the seat that learns too quickly. The desert looked like a landscape again. not a decision being made over and over. I still check the mirror more than a driver should. You want me to make sense of it the way I make sense of claims. Fine. Here is what numbers say. Speed did not matter. Distance did not behave. And the cabin accepted an occupant without consent. Here is what grief says. Someone waited too long and learned to keep waiting. Drivers like me, always at night, always alone, inherit the part of her that refuses to quit the gesture. I don't owe you a belief, only a record, so I'll give you the last sentences that fit. Some roads hold on to their secrets, and some passengers don't need an invitation to get into your car. If you meet her, don't promise anything. Promises require doors. What I didn't tell the police report. I remembered the first time I interviewed a widower in a kitchen that had forgotten to host steam. He wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee, like it was proof that heat hadn't left the world. He told me grief recalibrates distance. Rooms grow longer. Hallways develop a weight. On the highway that night, I learned that distance is a moral category as much as a spatial one. When the woman kept pace at a fixed remove, the world declared the wrong version of mercy. Mercy would have been losing sight. I returned to her name more than I meant to. Dorothy. Try saying it in an empty car and notice how the syllables insist on companionship. I imagined the daughter waiting on the California side, a porch light deciding whether to pretend it could guide a traveler most of the way. If Dorothy had arrived, she might have told the story as an inconvenience, trouble with the radiator, a trucker with a good heart, a delay fixed by daylight. Instead, the road taught her to repeat the gesture. Human beings are good at gestures. We evolve around them. A raised hand is the oldest interface we have between strangers and help. There's a reason the eyes arrived last. If she had looked at me with anything that resembled a human limit, tired, pleading, I would have been able to categorize the night. But the eyes announced an economy of attention I didn't understand. They did not ask. They acquired. I understood then that she was not after the seat, or the ride, or even my life. She wanted the agreement that distance had made with me. She wanted to move without moving. After I published a version of this for an internal memo, sanitized, framed as a cautionary note about stopping for pedestrians in unlit corridors, I received emails from other adjusters, a few troopers, a pair of long-haul drivers. They did not tell ghost stories. They reported anomalies, a woman who refused to blur, a scent that couldn't be justified, a heartbeat that sped up in cars whose engines had been off for hours. One trooper wrote, "I didn't see her in the mirror. I saw her in the window reflection inside the glass. She was where you see your own face when you check yourself." I do not collect these accounts for evidence. I collect them because the body likes company when it learns a new fear. I don't think Dorothy is angry in the way people hope. Anger grants a purpose witnesses can live with. What I felt in the car was older than anger. It was continuity. A life stumbled. An arm lifted. A truck forgot to stop. And the lifting kept happening. When you think about it in daylight, that's almost ordinary. We all keep doing the last thing we were doing, long after we should have been done. Some of us just find better operators. If you drive I-80 at night, and the world draws back from your headlights, remember this: the mirror is not your friend. It is an introduction. If you must look, glance. If you must stop, fill the passenger seat first. If someone waves you down in powder blue, there is no answer that will satisfy the question. Keep moving without speeding. Speed is melodrama, and melodrama attracts audience. And if, despite all this, she sits beside you, count, not miles, breaths. Every 10, tell yourself your name. The car needs to know who is permitted to remain. Postscript, records, and remainders. The case was never wolfed, and I do not propose solving it. I keep a photocopy of the article in my glove box, folded to the portrait that someone posed decades ago without asking it to last this long. When I stop at gas stations on that route, I buy flowers and don't pretend I'm not doing it for me. I place them on the passenger seat until the fragrance scares me with its sweetness. Then I leave them at the next exit. The desert dislikes offerings. It prefers confessions. So here is mine. I still drive at night. I still check the mirror, and every so often, I see the blue just at the edge of red, where taillights create another kind of sky. I do not stop anymore. I have learned what it means to decline an invitation that never needed one. Story number 2. I thought the night had run out of ways to hurt me until the road learned my name. Maps failed first, then time, then my hands. Somewhere between rain and mountain, a mile marker started choosing me back. I met other drivers in the dark, each one carrying the same missing hours. By sunrise, mile marker 237 no longer existed, and yet it wouldn't let me go. I'm Freya, the kind of nurse hired to show up where need arrives before resources. That life means thresholds and transits, clinics that bloom for a season, motels that remember too much bleach, and long lanes of asphalt that feel like a second spine. I keep my gear squared away, my charts backed up, my snacks lined like syringes, and my steering wheel at 10 and 2 until the interstate irons out my shoulders. Nights on the road aren't romantic. They are arithmetic. Fuel, distance, hours, and what you're willing to lose for one more county's worth of relief. That March, I was crossing the spine of Appalachia toward a new post in Ohio, determined to keep the mountains at arm's length. The forecast promised nothing dramatic, just patient rain and a quilt of fog stitched low across ridges. My little Honda Civic hummed like a diligent intern, not built for heroics, dependable if I didn't ask for miracles. I knew the drill. Watch the grades, respect the curves, let the trucks roar past with the force of their own momentum. I had crossed deserts that look like eternity and plains that look like a promise, and I had always come out the other side, a little shorter on sleep and a little wealthier for the next month's rent. The first oddness felt like a shrug from the dashboard, GPS directions repeating, then dropping, as if the voice had coughed. The map shivered. My dot hopped sideways, returned, rotated once like a coin, and settled. I told myself the mountains were being mountains. Signals echo in rock, satellites blink. But then the route revised itself with the confidence of a teacher. A polite detour, a short delay, construction ahead, a narrow state route peeled off from Highway 50 into trees arranged too neatly to be wild. And I followed because I'm paid to follow orders that save time and lives. The forest road never raised its voice. It didn't need to. It repeated itself until repetition became an instrument. Reflective signs blinked like the wake of my headlights. The pavement folded into the same bend again and again, like a scar that wouldn't heal. When the fog lifted, it did so by the same gesture. When it closed, it chose the same seam. And then the highway returned with the indifference of an old apartment building. I rolled past mile marker 237. Again, I recognized the scuff on the guardrail, the view that should have been thrilling, the curve that resented me. I had not driven in a circle. The trip odometer disagreed with the clock. The clock disagreed with the sky. My body looked for hunger or thirst or a yawn to explain it away, and found only a bristle of alertness that didn't know where to look. I did what travelers do when reason is threatened. I reduced the problem. Keep straight. Ignore the lady in the phone. Count the markers. 238, 239, 240. Progress is sanity, I told myself. And sanity is how you deliver meds at 4 in the morning with a smile that looks real enough. The rain turned to a meticulous drizzle. The windshield learned my wipers. The valley breathed under the road like a sleeping animal. Then the mirror filled with another set of headlights, trimmed to my pace as if we shared a throttle. When I eased up, it eased up. When I accelerated, it obliged. When I changed lanes, it adapted with elegant mimicry. Hazard lights in unison felt like two hearts deciding to fall together and never apart. In the breaths, when the fog thinned, I caught a silhouette too familiar, a small sedan like mine, the absence of a plate I could read, windows that turned my own face into an argument I could not win. I thought of the times I had walked hospital halls at midnight and seen, in elevator doors, a version of myself that lived one floor away. The GPS suggested another detour. The word detour is gentle until it isn't. I had planned to defy it, but my hands forgot who commanded them. The exit arrived where the voice said it would be, and the wheel yielded with the docility of a patient who has missed a meal and a night of sleep. The side road received me like a long hallway. Every few bends, metallic signs flashed with fonts that belonged to an older bureaucracy, the kind that stamped permits with real weight. The trees gathered with unnatural symmetry, trunks aligned as if some forester had whispered a geometry lesson to the hills. Time gave up on pretending. The dashboard stalled at 11:47 p.m. with the stubbornness of a broken shift clock. The fuel needle held shy of half, unwilling to report depletion. On the radio, frequencies traded fragments of languages I couldn't place, syllables that felt like place names held underwater. A nurse learns to count in strange ways, drops per minute, breaths per minute, the number of steps it takes to the crash cart. I counted curves. They counted back. When the side road ended, it didn't taper so much as stop. The fog let its hem go, and Highway 50 stood where it had always been, with the same valley arranged below, as if the scenery had been draped again, carefully by stagehands. Mile marker 237. Not metaphor, not déjà vu. The proof stood on two legs in the shoulder. Other vehicles, idling with their hazard lights synchronized like a row of monitors in an ICU. each one insisting that something was wrong and refusing to disclose what. We formed a small congregation at the guardrail, a man whose pickup had the posture of a loyal dog, a woman whose SUV still smelled like bubble gum and car seats, a pair of elders with their hands folded as if prayer had not left the toolbox. The pickup driver asked me how long. I told him a version of the truth, because medicine taught me that sometimes you must anchor the panic with words that can stand up to it. He pointed to the others. Their stories matched the shape of mine, even where the details changed. Each of us had a hole where a portion of night should have lived. Each of us had let the GPS write a sentence we didn't remember signing. We tried to invent an exit. We drove as a pack, noses to a point on the map, like patients following the nurse who knows the route past the visitor elevators to the back stairs. We turned our backs to Ohio and found ourselves at the mile marker that wouldn't stop knowing us. We cut the devices out of our lives and looked for stars and found a sky that declined, politely, to participate. Phones refused to speak to towers. We swore to stay rational next time and discovered there would be no next time like the last time. The loop was not a circle. It was a design that contained us as neatly as veins contain blood. What broke it, if anything broke it, was not dramatic. We were arguing over who would lead the next attempt when the world quietly made a different decision. In one beat, I was one of many. In the next, I was entirely alone. The highway warmer, the air ordinary in the particular way of mountain morning. The GPS purred, offering Ohio as if the night had never protested. The phone, fickle romantic that it is, confessed to full signal and lit up with the petty concerns of other lives. My supervisor on the line wondered why I sounded relieved to be 20 minutes behind. You don't measure survival only by miles. Sometimes you measure it by silence, what you do not say, because nurses know which stories can be told without naming their teeth. Later, when I crossed that route in daylight, the numbers politely leaped from 236 to 238. Tourist math, paper math, not real math. Later still, when curiosity overcame good sense, I found articles, forums, stray comments, drivers who had met a road that solved them like a riddle. Time distortions, detours to nowhere, a dead zone, construction that never had a crew. The state offered no record to comfort us, and the mountains do not answer email. Some swear the bedrock hums at a frequency that confuses signals. Some invent older names, thin places, slipways, gardens that prune travelers the way one prunes a hedge, cleanly, with an eye for shape. I am no priest and no physicist. I am a nurse who counts, and I counted enough to know this. The road chose me once, and I will not invite its attention again. In the car, under my breath, I make promises the way some people make offerings. I promise to obey the signs that exist in paint and metal. I promise to distrust a voice that is nowhere and everywhere at once. I promise to stop if I see a number that claims me. If you ever find yourself on a mountain road that repeats, treat it the way you treat a symptom that doesn't match the chart. Do not rationalize it into comfort. Do not perform obedience when disobedience is the only way to remain the person you intended to be. If a detour feels like a cage pretending to be a corridor, refuse the pretense. If a mirror follows your bumper, remember that not every twin is a sibling. And if a mile marker greets you like an acquaintance, greet nothing back. Take the ugliest path if it is yours, not the beautiful path that belongs to a voice you cannot hold accountable. I keep moving. That is the nature of the job. I care for strangers, then leave them with instructions on paper and a number to call. The places I pass through do not owe me explanations, and I do not owe them belief. But there are nights when the wipers begin their metronome, and the road lifts ahead like a surgical table, and I feel a hand I cannot see touch the steering wheel, steady and insistent as habit. Those nights I pull off. I find a diner, fluorescent and honest. I eat eggs that taste like regular decisions. I watch a clock that advances without apology past 11:47 p.m. I wait until the rain becomes ordinary, and the mountains remember that they are only mountains. Then I drive again, toward work that requires me, toward people whose emergencies are not arranged by trees. And if anyone asks me whether I believe in loops or traps or haunted infrastructure, I borrow a line I learned from patients who survived more than medicine. I believe in not going back. I believe mile marker 237 wanted to be remembered and then made itself absent, because absence is the last word a place can say. I believe that when machines speak with too much confidence, we should answer with our hands, not our ears. And I believe that whatever waits on that shoulder, shaped like a sedan, patient as a mirror, will spend a long time waiting. I kept a promise the mountains never asked to hear. On nights when the map whispers, I turn the volume down and make my own weather. A thermos of coffee, a route I can argue with, and a name I keep to myself. The first hospital in Ohio welcomed me with the fluorescent mercy of a supply closet. Shelves lined in exactness, gloves by the hundreds, gowns that sounded like dried leaves, masks folded like questions waiting for faces. But the mountain kept its hand in my hair for days afterward. Normal sounds were too clean, normal routes too eager to be obeyed. I drove surface streets like a person learning to walk again after a fracture, trusting weight, rediscovering balance. When an app suggested a shortcut, I pictured a narrow road sown with antique signs and clicked decline. Patience taught me, as they always do, how to focus on the smallest motion that means life. The stubborn swallow of an elder, relearning thirst. The rise of a child's chest after bronchodilators. The way pain loosens its jaw when you call it by its real name. In this business, control is a rumor. Competence is what you do instead of having control. The mountains had reminded me of that. I did not need the reminder. I tucked it away anyway, a sterile package in the bottom drawer, open only in case of recursion. One evening, charting at a bedside, I heard a family argue over maps, detours, construction that wasn't on the website. They had lost 30 minutes between Virginia Beach and the state line. They said someone had to be to blame. I showed them where to park without tickets. I found an outlet for their phone. I did not tell them about 237, not because I feared they'd laugh, but because I feared they'd nod and say, "Yes, us too." Not every fellowship is good for you. Some kinships require a ceremony to end them. When my contract ended, the road called again. Not with a voice, but with the arithmetic I know too well. Next posting, new county, mileage reimbursement, the useful ache of departure. I studied the map with the suspicion of a cop reading a confession. I drew a route a state north of the last one, then one farther south. Rejected both for weather, for time, for a feeling. In the middle of the night, I woke with my hands curled as if around a wheel. Muscle memory telling me it was time to change lanes. I chose daylight. I chose radio hosts who told jokes about home repair. I filled the car with the smell of citrus cleaners and new paper. There are truths. You know the way you know the road crown under your tires. Here is one. Once a place holds you in a way you cannot explain, every other place has to prove itself innocent. For months, I expected the sudden version of the familiar. The marker like a grin, the sign like a dare, the voice saying, "Construction ahead," when the only thing built was the trap. It never came. The world has the decency to be ordinary most days. But the way you drive changes after one night like that. You leave more room between you and the bumper in front. You check mirrors, not just for cars, but for replicas. You learn the weight of your own hands again. I haven't sworn off Highway 50. I have sworn off obedience that dresses itself as convenience. A nurse learns early that fast is only good when it is also right. Shortcuts through flesh are called injuries. Shortcuts through night can be worse. The miles keep collecting. The odometer is a calm friend. But I plan my way around the page where the numbers used to say 236, 237, 238, and now say something cleaner. Something that thinks it's a kindness. If you're reading this because someone told you to watch out for a mile that doesn't exist, do what you would do with a symptom that appears only on Wednesdays. Document it, respect it, and decide you will not be the next person to test its limits. You do not have to prove what tried to unmake you. You only have to arrive months later. A storm pinned me against an unfamiliar motel. I parked under a tired light and slept with my shoes near the door. At 11:47 p.m., I woke and didn't move, as if motion could pull a thread and unravel the room. The clock advanced. The numbers performed the trick of becoming other numbers. I laughed softly at myself, the kind of laugh that means the body has decided to hand authority back to the mind. I heated soup in a plastic cup and thought about the other drivers in that shoulder congregation, about how we did not exchange names, because names might let the thing that had noticed us notice us again. In the morning, I wrote an index card and taped it to the inside of my glove compartment. Detours are not laws. Silence is not consent. If a road feels designed for your doubts, turn around. If the world repeats, interrupt it with a human choice. You are allowed to be late, when late is the price of remaining yourself. Cards like that don't stop mountains from being old, or phones from being clever. They stop me from forgetting what a person is for. A person is for choosing. When I finally told the story out loud, I chose a diner booth and a friend who wears her disbelief with kindness. She listened the way good nurses listen when they are off shift, fully, with the acuity left on anyway. When I finished, she asked a question I had avoided asking myself. What if the loop wasn't a loop? What if it was a filter? What if the road needed to learn who I was before letting me proceed? It is a flattering horror to imagine being selected by a phenomenon. I rejected it, like an expensive treatment, with side effects too grim. I prefer an indifferent universe. Indifference is fair, still. Sometimes, in sleep that is almost morning, I imagine the car behind me and decide it is not a twin, but a future that refused to be mine. I imagine the trees leaning to see if my hands are strong enough to disobey. I imagine the old signs asking a bureaucracy older than the state for permission to keep existing. And I answer all of them by staying in my lane, by choosing exits only when the choice is mine, by letting daylight rule the curves. If you go looking for mile marker 237, you will not find it. That is the point. The number is the absence and the address, the warning and the invitation. The mile I drive now is always the next one. The ones behind are receipts. A life like mine is made of that kind of paper. It fades if you leave it in the sun. It fades even if you don't. But for a while, it can be held and shown to a clerk who knows what it proves. I am a traveling nurse. Highways will always take more hours from me than my living room does. But I have learned to set down hours no road deserves to have. If a device asks for them with too much confidence, I decline the request. If a landscape lines its trees like arguments, I consider it a debate I don't need to win. If a mile wants to be worshipped, I take the long way to a hospital full of more deserving gods, patients who need meals and meds, linens and listening, the small, reliable mercies that never require you to vanish and return. I keep a simple ritual for nights that smell like that rain. I speak a promise to the wheel, to my hands, to the clock that now moves freely past 11:47 p. The promise is not complicated. I will not be the path. I will be the person on it. West Virginia is still on my map. So is Ohio. So is every long stitch of interstate where I have hummed along between a day somebody needed me and a day someone else will. The mountains keep their counsel. I keep mine. Highway 50 can exist without 237. And I can exist without explanations that make the wrong thing feel finished. If we meet again, if a number writes itself on the shoulder and smiles too calmly, I'll know what to do with my hands. I'll take the road that is only a road. Story number 3. I was alone in the cab when the voice used my handle and told me to check beneath the trailer. I killed the cruise, touched the brakes, and smelled the sharp bite of diesel lifting off the winter air like a warning from the dark itself. 10 miles later, a pinhole glittered in my fuel line, and every mile before that replayed in my head with the echo of a man who wasn't supposed to be alive. They say radio waves bounce off the sky and come back different. I say sometimes they return carrying someone who can't quit the job that killed him. On nights when the prairies are empty and the sky turns to glass. Channel 19 still answers to a call sign from Denver. Mile high. My name is Oakley, but everyone on the CB calls me Big Oak. I didn't ask for the nickname. It just stuck after a winter chain-up outside Laramie, where I hauled a crippled reefer up a slick grade and bought the rookie in the mirror enough time to breathe. And I've been running long haul for 23 years. 2 decades, and change of coffee that tastes like burnt pennies and horizons that peel back the way prayer books do. Started when I was 22, fresh out of the army, thinking the open road would be a good way to see the country and make decent money without anyone looking over my shoulder? The road agreed to the first part and lied about the second. Freedom. Yes, until schedules wrapped around the map like barbed wire. I've driven through every state except Hawaii. I used to brag that line at diners just to watch the cook grin. Freight's a catalog of America. Everything from furniture to livestock to hazardous materials that I'm not legally allowed to talk about. People think highway monsters have teeth and tails. Mostly, they have weather. Black ice in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, fog so thick in Oregon that you couldn't see your own hood ornament. That's the kind of trilogy that makes a man superstitious. But all of it felt honest. Physics with bad manners, until the September night, when the radio started lying ahead of time. I had a paying load with a clock welded to it. Agricultural equipment out of Billings pointed toward Colorado. 2 hours behind schedule because of a mandatory rest period that the suit with the spreadsheet hadn't respected. The kind of arithmetic that turns men into cautionary tales. The equipment was expensive and time-sensitive. Needed to be on a farm in Colorado before the morning shift started. I told myself I'd thread the needle and buy back the minutes across empty country. Montana at night is a cathedral built from distance. The grasslands roll like a dark sea, and the sky throws down every star it owns. It can feel like you're driving through absolute nothingness, just your headlights carving a tunnel through the darkness, while the CB crackles with the voices of other drivers scattered across hundreds of miles of highway. On that run, the chatter came thin. Owner-operators discussing fuel prices, a gripe or two about dispatch, long silences stitched to the hum of tires. Then the voice came, clean, level. The sort of cadence you only get by surviving what would break other men. Breaker 19, this is Mile High, eastbound on 287 at mile marker 158. Got a jackknifed semi blocking both lanes. His signal sounded like he'd routed it through the stars. No static, no chew, just a perfect broadcast floating into my cab. I was rolling west, about 15 miles out, so I reached for the mic and answered on instinct. Much appreciated. Mile High. This is Big Oak westbound. Silence met me, like a ditch you can't see until you're in it. The channel lay flat. No thanks, no follow-up. Just the low, electric hush of an empty band. I kept the warning in my head anyway, and started scanning for detours. If there's a road sin that gets forgiven, it's caution. Mile 158 arrived without ceremony. No accident, no jackknifed semi, no emergency vehicles. Not so much as a nervous squirrel. The night stretched tight and clean. I asked the ether if I'd misheard, and a couple drivers came back puzzled. Nobody had anything on 287. 20 minutes later, the same voice. Breaker 19, mile marker 174. Vehicle fire on the right shoulder. Single car fully engulfed. Use the left lane. I was already past the spot, but the precision of his tone drove me to pull off and call it in anyway. The dispatcher took the details with that blend of weary and kind you learn to respect. A unit checked. The highway stayed ordinary. That should have been the moment I shrugged and blamed tropospheric ducting or some radio gremlin with a sense of humor. Instead, the feeling dug in behind my ribs. Not fear exactly, But the knowledge that the map I trusted wasn't the only one in use. The third call hit near Three Forks with a new pressure in the voice. Professional, turning urgent, the way a barometer drops before weather. Emergency traffic. Multi-vehicle accident. With injuries at mile marker 192. Debris in the right lane. Find alternate routes immediately. 10 miles up. I pushed, not reckless, just decisive. The way you do when you need the truth now. Nothing. The highway wore its usual midnight face. I ducked into a truck stop past the marker and made another report. The dispatcher's patience thinner this time, and standing under the fluorescents where moths wrote their asylum letters against the light. I realized I'd been treating the calls like misfires when they sounded more like early arrivals. Pete worked the night counter like a lighthouse keeper. 15 years on that island of coffee and chrome. When I described the voice and the handle, he closed the register and lowered his own voice as if the radio could overhear. You mean Harold Brewster drove from Mountain West out of Denver. He told it plain. Good driver, steady man, murdered at a rest area near Colorado Springs. 4 years gone. But the hill he died on didn't feel finished with him. Here's the thing about truck stops. Stories stack there the way pallets stack. And if you listen long enough, they build you a road you can drive. Pete's version wasn't the only one. Other drivers came forward with coffee mugs like testimonies, warnings that arrived ahead of reality. Not wrong, just offset, as if time itself had lane drift. A jackknife called at one marker, becoming a rollover 3 miles later. A vehicle fire transforming into a smoking engine 2 exits down. The man on the radio wasn't inventing disasters. He was seeing them from a place that couldn't quite agree with ours. Carol slid onto the stool next to me with the posture of someone who knows how a crosswind can ruin a day. 30 years on the corridor, handle Roadrunner, a ledger in her head that could bankrupt your excuses. She kept a notebook, ink against forgetting, where she logged each mile-high warning and what followed. 90%, she said. Not boasting, just auditing. Not exact, but close enough to save your life if you let it. She tried answering him once. Thanks for the heads up. Mile high. This is Roadrunner. Stay safe out there. And the reply came back, like a seatbelt catching in time. You, too, Roadrunner. Watch out for black ice at mile marker 203. It's worse than it looks. And Carol, tell my wife, I'm sorry I never made it home for dinner that night. She's probably still waiting. Carol never used her real name on channel. Harold had only shared miles with her. Not lives, but the dead. If that's what he was, don't need introductions. When she reached 203, a state patrol had lights on. Black ice, a hazard that hides its knives until you're already bleeding. I walked back to my rig with a sense that the highway was larger than the map. Maybe it's a river we mistake for a line. And sometimes the banks shift. Maybe a man can keep driving after the engine fails, if his reason is strong enough. And for 5 years after that first night, I heard Mile High a dozen times, always when conditions threaded the needle between bad and worse. He never bragged, never stunted, just the professional's math spoken into the dark. Left lane here, slow it down there, hazard ahead that isn't yet a hazard. I took his word, even when nothing showed. I took his word, especially then, the last time. Winter tore Wyoming into flurries and white sheets. I'd been rolling long enough that my bones felt like part of the suspension. The call sliced through the static with the clarity of a taut line. Big Oak, this is Mile High. You got a fuel leak under your trailer. Better pull over and check it before you lose your load, or worse. Stay safe out there, partner. I didn't argue. 10 miles later, under a canopy light, I watched diesel bead at a puncture like a cold tear. A small hole that could have emptied a big tank or invited a spark to do final things. I fixed what I could with a cut length of hose and 2 clamps from an emergency kit that had paid for itself more than once. Standing there with cold fingers and a warm sense of having been spared, I tried to picture the man who'd warned me. I could almost see him in the passenger seat, not haunting, exactly. More like riding shotgun the way veterans do, saying little, watching a lot. Since then, I've wondered about the physics of mercy. We talk about radio waves as if they're obedient, push to talk, release to listen. But every driver knows how the sky gets when the weather lifts the band and voices from Utah drop into Nebraska like they forgot the distance between. If signal can do that, if the air can bend and hold a voice past its appointment, who's to say time can't play along? Maybe Harold's warnings are what happens when duty refuses to end on paper. I've also wondered about the places we sleep. Rest areas at night collect every kind of person. Lost, hurried, angry, exhausted. A man like Harold could cross half the West without meeting a problem, and then the wrong pair of hands finds him when all he's trying to do is rest. Pete said they beat him to death for maybe $50 and whatever else they imagined. That fact won't lay still inside me. It keeps moving, into the part where Harold keeps moving. 2, you learn, after enough miles, that the living and the dead share lanes more often than we admit. Ask any cop who's worked a fatal and gone home with the smell of coolant and something else on his clothes. Ask a tow operator who hears a second door close when he's alone on the shoulder. The road is a long memory and a poor sleeper. Some nights it stays up and talks. So what do you do with a voice like his? You listen. You give back where you can. I've blocked lanes for strangers, run triangles for kids who didn't know better, called out weather when the app was late. I started keeping my own ledger, not of tragedies avoided, too proud, but of instructions followed. If the math of Mile High was generosity paid forward through the wrong kind of ending, then my part was simple. Act like someone's still counting on me after I'm gone. The night that taught me the last piece began simple, with a northern sky that looked like it had been polished. Rural Montana on Highway 287 has a flavor. Cattle asleep in dark fields, grain elevators standing like sentinels, small towns folded up for the night. The CB had been a companionable murmur. Then it went clean and carried one voice the way a good violin can carry a hall. Breaker 19, advising westbound traffic to take alternate routes. That was the first domino years ago, and I'd treated it like a trick of distance. Tonight, I let it instruct me. I took a farm road that paralleled the main, a lane and a half of frost and old fences. 10 minutes later, the GPS pouted about lost time. 20 minutes after that, a pair of rotating ambers fanned the dark. and I came upon a sheriff's unit, easing traffic around a minivan, nose deep in the ditch. No injuries, thank God, but I counted the math. If I'd stayed on 287, I would have hit the queue blind on ice, back on the main. A young voice came on the channel. First winter out, green enough to still think he was immortal. He was white-knuckling a dry van on recap hours and asking if the route ahead stayed open. I answered with what I knew. Grades, windbreaks, a fuel island that never carded out. Then the voice I'd been waiting for came between us, not stepping on our words, but folding in like a habit learned from 1,000 nights. Keep it in the left through the next mile. There's debris in the right. The kid said thanks. I grinned in the dark and pictured Harold nodding once and moving on. It hit me then that we all run dispatches from the same place eventually. Some of us sooner than we'd like. Some of us later than we deserve. If you love the work, the puzzle of weight and weather, the long arithmetic of time, you don't set it down just because your body can't make the miles. You keep speaking to the frequency that fed you, hoping somebody out there needs the thing you learned the hard way. All I know is that when I hear Mile High's voice crackling through my CB speaker, I pay attention. I'd told myself 100 times, and it had never felt like superstition. It felt like etiquette. On the road, etiquette is survival dressed in manners. You wave at the farmer who pulls his tractor half into the ditch so you can pass. You check the chain on the load you didn't strap. You hold the door with your elbow for the driver behind you because his hands are full of burritos and hope. Some nights I pull into a rest area and sit with the engine off, letting the heater tick down. I think about Harold's wife, whether she moved or stayed, whether the last dinner she made that night was something he liked. Grief makes landmarks out of ordinary things, and I suspect Channel 19 still crosses her kitchen some evenings when the weather is right. Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe she does, and keeps it to herself like a sequin in a pocket. A small flash to hold on to. There's a theory Carol has that I'm partial to. She says, it's like he can see what's about to happen, but he's looking at it from wherever he is now. And perspective is different. Time and distance don't work the same way for him as they do for us. I think about that when a warning is wrong. Maybe wrong is just what it looks like to us when two maps overlap and the coordinates try to reconcile. If a voice can arrive early, maybe it has to choose between being precise and being in time to matter. Harold seems to choose the latter. I've heard other stories. A desert run, where the voice said to top off now, and the driver found the next 4 pumps dark. A mountain descent, where a simple gear down one spared a set of smoking brakes and a prayer. Most of the drivers who tell these don't want credit. They want explanation, the way we all do. Something to point to, a lever to pull that turns chaos into policy. I don't think the road gives us that. I think it gives us each other. Tonight, before I lay down, I keyed the mic and sent a short message into the net. Appreciate you. Mile high. Keep watch. It wasn't worship, and it wasn't surrender to myth. It was a professional courtesy to a colleague still on duty. If the sky bounced it back to me later, so be it. If not, I knew it would ride with someone who needed it before sleep. One last thought. There are 1,000 ways to become a ghost. Most of them involve regret. If Harold's a ghost, he seems to have outrun that part. He keeps choosing usefulness. That's a good map to tape to the dash. In spring, the prairies green up too fast, and the wind behaves like it's been elected to office. I ran south with a flat bed full of steel and turned the dial to where the older drivers still talk in complete sentences. That night, the chatter was lighter than usual. That's how I remember the first time. Now I measure the distance between laughter and warning and find comfort that both still exist. There's a rookie myth that CB is obsolete, that apps have replaced voices. Apps can't smell a storm or hear a tremor in a man's tone. Apps won't call your handle the way your mentor did, won't tell you they're proud you learned to set your brakes before you open the door. On nights when the world feels like a humming machine with no operator, the channel proves there's still a hand on the switch. I pass the rest area where Pete said Harold died and make myself look. Not to gawk. Respect. A clean concrete building, vending machines that steal your singles, a picnic table nobody uses after sundown, a domestic scene stapled to a violent memory. The killers are statistics now. The obituary is paid for. The companies routed around the hole he left. But the physics of mercy keeps broadcasting, and I think that counts for something larger than closure. Sometimes I play a game to keep the miles honest. I imagine what Harold would say if he were in the jump seat. Loads a little, nose heavy. Oak. Back off. 2. Watch that crown. It'll pull you right. That car in your blind? He's not looking at you. He's looking at his phone. The advice isn't mystical. It's the practical liturgy of a trade. Maybe some bonds are stronger than whatever separates the living from the dead. Maybe the highway itself holds on to the voices of drivers who spent their lives keeping others safe. I don't pretend to know which of those lines is truer. I know only that my job got quieter when I believed it alone and got better when I understood it wasn't. The kid from that winter run messaged me months later. He'd made it through the season with all axles attached and a new respect for wind advisories. He asked about the voice he'd heard and whether it was a prank. I told him the truth as I see it. If it saves you, it's real enough. Then I taught him where to mount his antenna and how to listen past the noise. He'll tell that to someone else someday. And maybe, if the night is right, another voice will cut in and tell them to move left for debris. This is the part of the story where I'm supposed to provide a moral, a closing argument filed neatly under unexplained phenomena. But trucking resists conclusions. Every destination pays you in another start time. Every sunrise is a receipt for the darkness you carried. Harold doesn't need a eulogy from me. He needs what he's already had. Company on the frequency. Drivers who take the warning and live to pass it on. I fold the logbook closed and set the alarm for a time that will make the next shipper happy. The wind noses the trailer and then thinks better of it. Out past the sodium lights, the land resets to its quiet shapes. I sit with my hands open for a moment, as if holding a steering wheel that's still humming. All I know is that when I hear Mile High's voice, I pay attention because Harold Brewster is still looking out for his fellow drivers, even from whatever distant mile marker he's broadcasting from now. Maybe that's faith. Maybe it's just respect. Out here, they can be the same thing. And if you're rolling tonight, empty or heavy, green or gray, keep a channel open. The road remembers. Sometimes it even answers back. Story number 4. 500 miles of daylight. And I was the only thing making shadows. Engines are honest. Roads are not. If precision can be haunted, I've seen the ghost that measures it. 3 black shapes learned my heartbeat and kept it synchronized. And somewhere in the desert, time runs in lanes like paint that never dries. I'm Daxton, hands cured in solvent, sleep salted with brake dust, the kind of mechanic who counts hours in torque values. I build machines that turn distance into confession, that make a straightaway feel like a lie detector. My shop is a chapel of scored knuckles and dyno graphs. The only sermons I preach are horsepower curves. Out in the flats, heat shimmers, and truth stands still long enough for you to measure it. I drove east. With a fastback, I'd nursed out of rust and regret. The engine inhaled with discipline and exhaled through equal-length pipes, like a thesis you can feel. Steering was telepathy. Pedals, a promise kept. September light stretched the car into a blade. I wasn't chasing trouble, just the kind of silence where a machine can sing without being interrupted by anyone else's idea of restraint. Utah obliged. The highway ran like a black seam through red stone and scrub. A line so straight, it made the horizon look like a rumor. I let the speed settle into something adults call reasonable and mechanics call baseline. The chassis stayed flat. Needle climbed without drama. Air was dry enough to turn motion into math. Then geometry stepped into my mirror. 3 black SUVs arranged themselves with textbook neatness. 1 centered, 2 flanking, spacing tight enough to calibrate a surveyor's instrument. Convoys breathe. Real drivers drift. These shapes did not. They held positions as if lane paint were rails, and they were tired of improvisation. I eased up 2 gears, made space, watched for human error. None arrived. I slackened to the speed limit like a model citizen. The triangle shrank in precise proportion, as if a formula had been updated and reapplied. I entertained the easy story. Some agency moving someone important. But even professionals telegraph fatigue. People nod, hesitate, get thirsty. Whoever shadowed me either didn't need water or didn't need bodies. When an empty pullout offered itself, I slipped off in a single, clean motion. The black formation flowed past, untouched by my absence, vanishing around a bend that looked like an eraser mark drawn across the desert. 20 minutes later, their presence reappeared without the courtesy of approaching. They were simply restored. Distance identical. Formation immaculate. Fear doesn't ring a bell. It changes your posture. My shoulders tightened. My breath learned discipline. I listened. My own exhaust wrote clear sentences in the air. Behind me, no roar, no tire hymn, no turbulence kissing the mirrors, as if those SUVs belonged to a draft of reality, where friction never got invented. I stopped pretending I wasn't curious. 4th gear woke the crank's ambition, and the car lengthened its stride. The speed where the horizon walks toward you arrived quietly. Tall vehicles should wobble. Their shadows should argue with crosswinds. These did not wobble and did not argue. Their triangle cut the air like a thought too sharp to swallow. I tried being rude. Sudden exit, swift re-entry, lane feints, short bursts, hard, clean braking. The formation responded, not like pursuers, but like a choreographed reflection. Moves mirrored with the same margins, never intruding, never yielding, never revealing a license plate or a driver's silhouette. It felt less like being followed and more like being measured. An overlook appeared, an eyebrow of pavement carved into sandstone. I kept my indicators honest and my intentions dishonest, then folded the wheel late enough to make the front tires ask me if I meant it. The car set down with feline composure. I pivoted to face the highway, ready to watch them commit to a choice. Nothing came. Not a smudge of glass, not a rectangular promise taking shape in heat. The road was a black line, pretending it had never heard of triangles. Silence grew heavy the way tools do when you remember the last time they hurt you. I gave it an hour. Pickup, family van, cattle hauler. No black, no choreography, when the temperature forgave everything. I set back onto the line and let the sky finish turning to evening. The mirror showed only me, which is sometimes the scariest traffic you can face. Back home, distance did its best to make me sensible. I tried to file the whole thing under fatigue plus imagination. But imagination doesn't hold a lane at 130 with trigonometric dignity. So I did what any modern pilgrim does. I went to the altar of search bars and asked the desert what it remembered. There it was, yellowed and official. An early 80s convoy, 3 vehicles, a synchronized departure from the safe geometry of asphalt into the hard grammar of gravity. The report offered polite fictions, a medical emergency, a chain of reactions, a physics lesson with homework left undone. But the numbers disobeyed the narrative. Identical angles, identical trajectories, identical end. Rumor had done its wandering since then. People wrote about a night procession you could glimpse if you were unlucky. Machines moving like compass needles along the same stretch, dissolving exactly where the accident had written its period. Patrols searched. Tire tracks refused to exist. Witnesses learned to use words like phantom without irony. The state forgot. The desert didn't. I don't offer curses when a torque spec will do. But I know resonance, how an instruction can get trapped in the shape of a thing, humming silently until the right frequency walks past and wakes it. Maybe those vehicles learned her one order too well. Maybe the road learned them. Maybe the air is a vault, and someone lost the key in 1983, and the lock still remembers. Since that day, I've traveled the 191 only under a forgiving sun, with the mirror tilted like a superstition. I've met other drivers who talk around the same fear until it points to the same coordinates. 3 black shapes pacing them with cold courtesy, keeping a respectful quarter mile as if memorizing their pulse, then vanishing at the overlook where the view is gorgeous if you don't know what happened below it. Some call it a loop, some call it a test. I call it a mission that never received the one word it was built to obey. Stop. If a stretch of road can keep accounts, that ledger has 3 lines written in black ink that won't dry. And when conditions match whatever the algorithm loved, the entries stand up, align themselves, and find someone who won't ignore mathematics. They don't chase. They calibrate. They escort you to the place where a bad instruction ended and a worse memory began. And then they leave you with the one thing a driver hates most. A question you can't outrun. I still build engines because engines are honest. I still drive because the desert, when it isn't haunted, is the last clean laboratory left to a man with a wrench and a need. But on that highway, in that light, I know I'm not the only thing moving. Somewhere out there, 3 vectors are waiting for their condition to be met. If you ever feel your speed lock to a grid that nobody else can see, you'll understand what I learned. Sometimes the most dangerous driver on the road is the one that forgot how to be human and remembered perfectly how to be a line. Story number 5. I thought I knew every bend in the mountains until the mountain learned my name. I thought I'd mastered risk until risk stepped into my headlights and raised a hand. I thought I was alone, 2 sleeping kids and a tired mother, until duty returned from the dead. I thought professionalism would save me. Instead, a stranger's timing rewrote the night. And at Dead Man's Curve, someone who shouldn't exist made sure we did. My name is Valeria, a real estate agent based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I spend my working life gliding between property lines and ridge lines, translating acreage and views into livable futures for people with weekend dreams. Clients want seclusion, but require convenience. They ask for birdsong and fiber internet in the same breath. I keep calendars balanced, tires rotated, and contingencies ready. I also carry blankets in the van because children measure time differently, and mountain showings can turn hours into weather. That November 2019, the sky changed its mind on the drive home. The day had begun with neat folders, smiling introductions, and city expectations. It ended with disappointment in a parking lot outside Black Mountain, as a couple from New York declared the mountains too rustic for their tastes, their budget too slender for their wish list. I nodded, kept my tone even, and swallowed the sting that comes when work turns to exhaust in the lungs. My kids, Emma and Marcus, had already curled under those travel-worn blankets, dreaming against the tinted glass. A cold front should be a concept. That night, it was a hand across the world. Rain hardened grain by grain until every twig wore armor, and the road took on the shine of a blade. I measured distance in breaths, in the steady rhythm of wipers, in the way my tires hummed low through water that wasn't water anymore. The thermometer slid downward as if a string had been cut. I reduced speed. I sat up straighter. I listened to traction the way you listen to a child in another room. The map in my head brightened with hazard as I approached Highway 9. The locals call the next sequence of bends Dead Man's Curve. Not official, but more accurate than signage. The engineering there feels like a dare. A rock wall to the left, space to the right where gravity keeps a ledger. Guardrails arrive pre-scarred and never look new for long. On dry afternoons, the place demands respect. Under freezing rain and fog, it asks for offerings. Headlights feathered across reflective paint, the world narrowed to the white of lane marks and the pale haze that comes when moisture turns the air into a veil. That was when the road put a person in front of me. He stood center lane, steady, a long pole in his hands, the red face of a sign catching light. The vest was safety orange, the helmet white, the posture trained. I braked to a drifting stop and lowered my window a few inches. a slit of wet air entering like a warning. "Is traffic blocked?" I asked. He didn't speak. He held the sign the way a compass holds north. I waited. Time drew itself long. A strand of cold pulled across patience. 3 minutes, perhaps, maybe more. When he moved, it was to the shoulder with a practiced sweep of the arm. The universal invitation to proceed, but proceed with humility. I thanked him, habit more than hope, eased forward, and settled the tires into the first bend, as if seating glass into a frame. He appeared again. Farther ahead this time. Same stillness, same message. Stop. The pattern repeated. An odd choreography. Halt, settle, wave through, crawl. He was always there, one curve ahead, as if the mountain were dealing him to me card by card. No flares, no cones, no trucks bristling with salt or blades. Just a man whose hand signals were so precise that they felt like a language the road itself spoke. Professional eyes notice professional moves. He didn't fidget. He didn't look cold. The rain lacquered the world, but seemed to sheet around him without landing. When he lifted his arm, I watched the second hand of my own heartbeat and counted down the slope. Each time he stopped me, the next curve was bitter with ice, the kind no tread can bully, the kind only patience can pass. Each time he released me, it was as if he had measured not just my speed, but the tiny mercy in the surface ahead, where rubber could keep faith. We inched through a geography of mistakes made permanent. Bent rail, scraped rock, places where someone's evening had ended earlier than planned. The van moved, as if escorted. My children kept sleeping. The storm kept building its quiet kingdom on every branch and cable. All the while, I nursed the wheel and kept my foot a whisper above the brake, crossing the S-bends that feel too tight even when the world is kind. At last, the grade softened. The road uncoiled into a calmer line, and the headlights pushed farther. I glanced back to where the last stop had been, planning a small gesture, a raised hand, a nod, something human to close the ledger he'd opened. The lane behind me was empty. The curve was empty. The mountain was an idea again, instead of a presence in the glass. Morning granted proof the way morning does. With coffee, with headlines, with numbers that have already happened. I opened the local news. There were travel warnings and footage of trees casting off their new armor in brittle sheets. There was an official statement. No county crews on Highway 9 overnight. Conditions were beyond safe operating limits. Non-emergency work suspended. There was a roll call of what the weather had taken. Spinouts, tow calls, a pickup that had broken through the fence of steel and gravity. The driver gone before dawn had a chance to listen. A trooper's quote measured the storm against 2 decades of memory and found it heavier. If no crew had worked the route, then who had measured my night in increments of safety? I looked for the kind of answer you find in records and photographs. People forget stories. Paper keeps them. I searched obituaries and accident reports, old coverage that lives behind paywalls and in scanned PDFs. A name emerged like a mile marker through fog. James Mitchell. In 2014, while managing traffic at mile marker 47, He had placed barriers around a crash on a night like mine. Rain turned to armor. Urgency on a slope. A driver lost control, slid through the work zone, and ended the shift nobody had planned to end. He was 43. He had a family. The article explained the sequence with the careful cold that journalism maintains around grief. The image by the column showed a man whose posture I already knew. Kind eyes, square shoulders, a look that says the job is to keep strangers from becoming names in articles. When I saw that photograph, I felt two truths stand side by side. He should not have been there last night. He had been there last night. I started asking around. Agents who work the mountain counties keep a private atlas of weather, detours, and soft-shouldered miracles, quietly, to those who wouldn't laugh. I described the vest, the sign, the deliberate timing. Stories came back like lights from houses on a dark road. People had seen a highway worker who arrived only when night was heavy and visibility was poor. During fog, hung low between trunks. During rain that turned to a mirrored skin. During storms that set the guardrail ringing for days after. He would stand where the curve pretended to be harmless, raise a hand, make you wait long enough for doubt, then wave you through the one safe second the mountain offered. When clear stretches returned, he would be gone before gratitude could catch up. Someone who knew the department better than I do said James Mitchell was a man who counted successes as people getting home and counted failures by the crashes he could not prevent. If any person was going to treat death as a shift change instead of an ending, it would be him. If any person would insist that the road could be kinder than it is, it would be him. I've driven that corridor many times since, always choosing daylight, always choosing fair weather when I can. I have never seen him again. But sometimes the radio goes quiet. The ridgeline cuts the sky like a sentence, and memory steps in as surely as a sign. I keep my speed soft at Dead Man's Curve. I picture a man in county gear who knows distances the way a medic knows pulses. I imagine him measuring, choosing, granting safe passage in increments the rest of us would stumble past. There are explanations that reduce the world. Stress, fatigue, the mind imposing a narrative on hazard. There are other explanations that don't reduce anything. A worker finishing what duty asked of him. A promise kept beyond the hours of a time card. I no longer argue with either. I do keep the van maintained. I do check forecasts enough to make meteorologists proud. I keep the blankets washed because my children still fall asleep in moving rooms. And because a mother recognizes the difference between ordinary and narrow. On nights when the weather turns the mountains into a hall of glass, I find myself making a small wish that isn't small at all. If we cross those bends when calculation isn't enough, may the timing favor us. May a professional hand agree. May a man at mile marker 47 raise his arm once more. And if that is only memory, then let memory be the thing that saves us. Story number 6. I didn't believe a voice could cross decades until the desert taught me how sound remembers. I didn't believe a stranger could know the shape of my life until a frequency carved me open like a canyon. I didn't believe in ghosts, not the sheet and chain kind, only in the ones made of songs, static, and regret. That night, the sky was clean enough to see the bones of the universe, and still something hid between the stars. If you've ever driven alone at 3 in the morning, you know how the dark can lean close and speak your name. My name is Tedo, and I work as a delivery driver for a regional logistics company that specializes in overnight shipping between Arizona and Colorado. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well enough to support my family. And I actually enjoy the solitude of long-distance driving. The world shrinks to the width of your windshield. The rest of your life rides behind you, sealed up and rattling gently in the trailer. The cluster glows a quiet constellation. Mile markers tick like a soft metronome nobody else hears. The way the highway stretches out ahead of you like a ribbon of possibility under the desert stars. When the air cools and the tires hum, my thoughts lay themselves out in straight lines, long enough to climb. I've been running this route for 3 years, and I thought I knew every mile of Interstate 40 between Phoenix and Denver, every truck stop and rest area and scenic overlook. I knew where the pavement healed and where it still ached. I knew the coffee that tasted like old pennies, and the one register clerk who always slid me an extra packet of sugar for luck. Out there, routine is a kind of superstition. Touch the same habits, and maybe the night will leave you be. It didn't. I left Phoenix with a trailer full of expensive promises, thin glass and thinner deadlines, headed for a boardroom that would be bright and merciless by 6 a.m. The sun went down clean. The city fell away like a coat slipping from shoulders. Saguaro turned to silhouettes. The desert put on its jewelry, cold starlight and the slow gleam of far semis. I set the cruise, set my jaw, and let the miles unwind. 2 hours in, the windshield was a black mirror framing my own face, and the red pricks of taillights miles ahead. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow, I started scanning through radio stations to find something to keep me company through the long desert miles ahead. Night does tricks with AM, bounces it off the sky, lets voices skate impossible distances. I flicked past weather, sports talk, a preacher promising relief in exchange for the right ache. Then I heard it, the kind of brass that asks your bones to stand up straighter. That's when I found KDES 1340 on the AM dial. The announcer cut in with that practiced smile you can hear but never see, broadcasting from what the station identification announced as the high desert of Arizona. He called himself Johnny Midnight, which is the sort of name that either makes you roll your eyes or turn the volume up. I did both. He didn't sound like now. He sounded like the world when people wore hats on purpose and smoke meant a party, not a warning. He set up a Glenn Miller side with a neat little history bow. And somewhere in the patter, he said, "Hard to believe that was 8 years ago now." If he meant 1939, my math tugged the year backward into 1947. A radio costume, I decided. A theme hour with better research than most. The songs were a ballroom stitched together by brass and reed. Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman. Not nostalgia, not kitsch, the real thing, spun clean, without the moth holes of static. I drove inside that music like a ballroom had been poured over the highway. The desert, a dark parquet floor. Between numbers, Johnny laughed a little, the way good DJs do. like he'd just set a drink down to talk to you. I don't keep a CB. I do have a cell phone. And the station read out a number in that cheerful cadence. Stations use when they expect you'll never call. I called. The line picked up on the second ring. KDES, you're on with Johnny Midnight, he said. And the room of the cab felt smaller, like he had just sat down beside me without opening the door. Nat King Cole, I said, because some names are keys, and that one opens a room where the lights are kind. He agreed, too quickly, like we were finishing each other's sentences. And then he said my name. He'd used my name. Not the easy English version, the one with the edge of my father's tongue in it. There are times your blood chooses ice because heat would make you panic. I said something about Christmas songs playing fine in February, which is true and also stupid. And I hung up like the phone had become an ember. Minutes later, Nat drifted in, velvet and precise. And when the last chord laid itself down, Johnny came back. He sent me safe travel wishes by name. He sent regards to Maria and Sophia, which I hadn't given him and never would. A pair of names held carefully in a house in Glendale, asleep under the same quilt my mother stitched. He told me to keep my eyes open through the long, straight stretches. He reminded me of a diner in Holbrook that had gone out of business 3 summers ago, where Maria once stole my last fry and laughed like a match being struck. He started programming the soundtrack to my life. La vida es un sueño, because Maria had it on loop the day we finally moved a box of plates we didn't need. Bésame mucho, because Sophia used to go quiet for that one. Cheek against Maria's shoulder, the way babies agree with the world for a few minutes and then forget how. Each song landed like the needle had been listening to our kitchen for years, waiting for a chance to show off. I didn't call again. He didn't need me to. He carried the conversation we hadn't started yet. He asked me how the business plan was going, as if I had told him anything more than a fantasy on late nights when the highway was kind. He told me my father would have been proud, and that word, would, plucked a wire that runs through every choice I've made since I was 15. I crested the Arizona line and started the long, slow climb where the road remembers it's a mountain. Wind leaned at the trailer. My hands found the wheel like it was a handrail. Johnny let a Tommy Dorsey chart breathe for the length of a valley, and then came back in with that tone DJs use when they mean it. He said he'd been watching over my family a long time. He said my grandfather Miguel listened to KDES on nights like this. He said Miguel called in dedications to Elena, which is the sort of detail a liar doesn't reach for because it's too plain, too true. The desert, I've learned, is full of witnesses. There are rocks that remember water, wind that remembers trees, and nights that remember voices. I drove inside one of those nights, and it kept opening doors. Story number 7. I keep emergency rooms quiet by force of will. But nothing taught me how to steady a steering wheel that had slipped into another century. I thought the fog was only weather. It was a border. I believed maps were promises. That night, they were rumors. I trusted photographs. They trusted me back. Until they didn't. I tell this in the first person because there's no one else who came home with me. I am an emergency physician, trained to untangle chaos with protocol, to measure the unmeasurable by blood gases and vitals, to doubt my own certainty before I doubt physics. On a Sunday in October 2020, I left a conference that had turned medicine into a sales floor and pointed a rental up into the mountains. The fastest route back, the dashboard insisted. The rental car company had given me a white Lexus sedan with GPS navigation, and I gave up on the coast because the Pacific had rolled in with a fog so complete it took the horizon hostage. I left Monterey around 4:00 p.m., thinking I'd be home by 7 or 8. The road climbed and narrowed. The GPS began subtracting my confidence in 12-second increments, recalculating, rerouting, rescuing me from accidents I could not see, and construction I did not believe in, until the cones rose from the mist like teeth. The detour was so polite, it felt harmless. That's when the GPS announced that there was a major accident ahead, blocking my route, and that I should take the next right to follow a detour that would add only 15 minutes to my trip. It offered San Benito, Esperanza, and Valverde as alternatives, as if past and present were side streets of the same subdivision. The lane lines sharpened. The fog thinned as though someone had wiped the world with a cloth. San Bonito, spelled in way on a sign, another way in my memory, waited in the valley like a pressed flower. A post office, a general store, a gas station, a small cafe, all painted in the optimism of after a war you won but haven't finished paying for. Lawns were exact. White picket fences didn't apologize for cliché. They invented it. Cars leaned along the curb, smelling of carburetors and wax. A man in pressed khakis came out and placed me carefully in his field of view, like a precious object too modern to be trusted. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his cap. "Fill it up with regular." His voice had the click of etiquette, not the shrug of a transaction. The numbers on the pump belonged to a math problem from my parents' childhood. The price displayed on the pump was 98 cents per gallon. I told myself it was a stunt, a tourist town's wink. When I handed over my card, machinery cleared its throat, like it remembered cash more fondly. He had to swipe it the old-fashioned way, eyes narrowing at the chip, as if it were an insect that might bite him. I left with a full tank and a feeling that the air had been ironed. Esperanza, if that's how it's spelled when you say it out loud, was wider, busier, and exactly as unhurried. Shop windows held 5 and dime ambitions, household goods, children's toys, the inventory of a country convinced the future is a perfect kitchen. A drugstore with a soda fountain held teenagers who looked rehearsed by photographs rather than by life. And a movie theater showed titles I could not place, advertised as new releases in letters permanently fresh. I asked questions and received answers that were not nostalgic reenactments, but the present tense of another era. Eisenhower was the president. The interstate was a rumor becoming scaffolding. The Soviet Union was a weather system to watch. I told myself stories about living museums, about towns that sell their yesterdays to pay for their tomorrows. But no one charged admission, and no one narrated. They treated my presence as unremarkable, the way small towns treat a bus breaking down. You can stay for coffee, but the road will take you when it's ready. Valverde introduced itself with columns and brick. A courthouse, a bank, a hotel with prices that had sounded like pranks. I chose the Golden State Restaurant because hunger is persuasive and curiosity is terminal. The menu read like an artifact. Complete dinners for under $2, coffee for 15 cents, pie for 30. The waitress's pink uniform was pressed as if it still held the shape of the hangar. She set down coffee that tasted like the engine of America and never once broke character, because it wasn't a character. When I asked about the town's history, I got present tense weather reports. Television was an arrival. Modern appliances, a revolution. Jets, an assault on distance. I stayed too long, trading questions for names, names for stories, stories for an understanding I refused to write down. Time lost interest in me. When I finally checked, it was nearly midnight, although the clock of my body claimed otherwise. My phone showed no signal bars, and the battery was receding, like a tide going out to show what it had hidden. The GPS still drew a map of the world, but not the one I carried in my head. Roads snuck off in directions I had never learned. Landmarks didn't match. Leaving felt like pulling free of something sticky and kind. The return trip folded like paper. I found myself back on familiar highways without any clear memory of how I'd gotten there. The car's dashboard told 9:30 p. My phone insisted I'd been missing for the length of an overnight shift. I slept like I owed someone money. Woke with the kind of caution you reserve for bad lab results, and checked the photos, because that is what modern people do when reality blinks. There they were, the cafe, the main street, the faces I had borrowed for a night, fine as thread, exact as a diagnosis. Then, as if a hand turned a dial, colors faded and details disappeared. Windows unhung themselves, paint became air. People erased themselves with exquisite politeness, until all that remained were empty lots and foundations choked by weeds. I watched the proof of my sanity choose a different patient. I spent a weekend in the archives, hunting time as if it were a pathogen with a known culture. Card catalogs are just servers that never learned to crash. I cross-referenced maps, scanned microfilm, asked a librarian what the mountain range calls itself when it's alone. The Gabalin Mountains, east of Salinas. And there, in ink nobody thought would travel this far, were the names that had ridden my nerves. San Benito, Esperanza, Val Verde. They were not folklore. They were coordinates. They were also gone. The year was 1957. The month was March. The magnitude was 6.2. Landslides did what wars could not. 847 people had died. The article said in print that has no reason to lie. Survivors were relocated. The ground kept its secret by swallowing it. The state honored the bargain by calling the area wilderness and leaving it alone. I found photographs taken weeks before the Earth changed its mind, February 1957, and one of them framed the Golden State Restaurant so precisely that I felt the jolt you feel when a patient says the exact phrase you wrote in your note before seeing them. The caption credited a traveling photographer who did not outlive his subject. I have driven that way since, in broad daylight, on roads that obey the DMV. I do not find San Benito any spelling. I do not find Esperanza any spelling. I do not find Val Verde, except on the receipt I keep in an envelope that says, "Do not trust me." It lists February 15th, 1957, the cost of pie, The cost of coffee. The cost of pretending that history is a film you can pause. The photos on my phone have completely faded now. Not lost, but corrupted. The way memory is corrupted, by wanting it to be kinder. I am trained to file unusual cases under the shelf labeled "Explain Later." This one refuses to be put away. I suspect that fog is not weather, but porosity, a loosening of stitched edges between adjacent times, and that certain roads are not roads, but sutures. I suspect some towns do not end. They recur, like a rhythm you hear through a wall. I suspect the people I met are still living out their final weeks, making coffee that will be poured and poured again until the earth chooses otherwise. So here is my chart note. For anyone who needs a record, chief complaint. A detour that intersects with 1955. History of present illness. I was completely lost in the hills east of Salinas, then found what loss was for. Assessment. Cases where modern medicine collides with forces we don't fully understand. Plan. Keep the receipt. Let the photos go. Drive the coast when you can. Do not trust fog. Do not distrust it either. If you find yourself there, if the GPS speaks to you like a parent and suggests a right turn that does not appear on paper, remember the price of coffee. Remember the tilt of a cap. Remember that some places still believe in the present tense, even when the calendar has abandoned them. Pay cash. Tip well. Leave before midnight. And when you get home, do not ask your photos to tell you the truth. Ask your tires. Ask your hands. Ask what time it is. And accept all three answers. Story number 8. I've spent my life proving that the living lie. I never imagined the dead would try to tell the truth to me directly. The first hint wasn't a voice from a grave. It was a passenger seat, nudged forward, like someone shorter wanted a better view of the road. Security footage confirmed what my eyes refused. A calm man in a blue work shirt riding shotgun while I drove alone under Kentucky stars. He had a name. Once. A badge. 2. And on that highway, he'd been left behind like broken glass by the time I realized he wasn't haunting me. He was leading me. I was already following him into the dark. I've been an insurance investigator long enough to recognize patterns that don't want to be recognized. My name is Sage. I work as an insurance investigator for the kind of firm that thrives where accidents stop making sense. After 28 years in this business, skepticism isn't an attitude. It's a reflex. You look for seams in stories, for timelines that creak under their own weight, for motives that hide inside numbers. What I didn't expect along Interstate 75 was a case that would untie my rules and retie them into a knot only a dead man could pick apart. The calls started as they always do. 7 hit and runs scattered like shotgun pellets over 18 months on a 50-mile ribbon between London and Corbin. Different hours, different weather, different vehicles, if you believed the paint flecks and mirror shards. The similarity was a whisper you only heard if you pulled over and let the road cool beneath your shoes. Each victim, a man in that gray middle age, each within a quarter mile of an overpass, each walking the shoulder, not crossing. A coincidence that kept repeating itself until coincidence sounded like an alibi. You would think the fraud angle was mine, and it was, at first. My company had been hired by the Kentucky State Police to sniff out a scheme. Staged pedestrian impacts meant to cash checks, not close caskets. Maybe someone scripted injuries and got panic instead. But statistics only take you to the door. The door opens for other things. Eastern Kentucky wears its beauty like a bruise. Rolling timbered hills, flare of autumn, shadow of closed mines and shuttered storefronts. I was driving a plain gray sedan, the kind of car that doesn't invite memory. The dashcam blinked, the GPS kept score, and the upholstery smelled faintly of someone else's miles. On the third day, northbound toward Corbin, I glanced right and felt the first hair rise. The passenger seat was not where I'd left it. Pushed forward, backrest ratcheted upright. Someone shorter than me had settled in, made themselves at home, then left without leaving. I did the ritual, pulled into a rest area, checked locks, windows, zippers, cases. Nothing disturbed. No pry marks on weather stripping. No absence where an absence should shout. I set the seat back. I promised myself I was tired. The promise lasted until morning, when the motel's sodium orange light fell over a sedan whose seat had moved again. Same dimensions as yesterday's ghost. After that, the pattern was relentless. The seat kept resuming that posture like a habit the car couldn't break. Then came other accommodations. The cushion took an indentation that stayed a few minutes after I exited. The seatbelt sometimes lay flat and latched when I hadn't touched it. The climate control nudged itself cooler, as if there were heat to subtract. I started documenting as any investigator does. Photos at each stop, timestamps, angles. I was looking for a glitch, a mechanical bias, a playful valet with a key fob. Instead, the images gave me the impression of a person, a faint outline pressed into fabric, the way clouds suggest faces you don't want to see. Middle-aged, blue-collar, casual. A man accustomed to long roads and silence. The next breadcrumb fell at a truck stop near Corbin, over bad coffee and good gossip. Two troopers at the counter were discussing the case in tones meant for each other. They'd been pulling security footage, they said, and in at least 3 videos. A vehicle passed the accident zones with someone visible in the passenger seat, even when drivers swore they were alone. Perhaps a reflection, perhaps artifact, perhaps not. I introduced myself, showed credentials, traded stories like cards. When they let me see the clips, the world narrowed. There was my gray sedan. There was the passenger I didn't have, early 40s, blue work shirt and jeans, a posture you trust if you've ever followed a calm back into a burning house. Sometimes his hand lifted, as if pointing out landmarks only he could name. We cross-indexed timestamps and mile markers. The passenger appeared on film whenever my car passed within a quarter mile of an accident site, usually inside 24 hours of the impact. It didn't feel like haunting. It felt like a perimeter. A trooper mentioned an older file, a grief folded away and never ironed. In 2016, Detective Michael Hendris had been struck while working the shoulder of I-75, a hit and run, while investigating hit and runs. The case never named a driver. When they pushed a photograph across the table, the room shifted. The cheekbones in the still image matched the geometry in the videos. The casual calm matched, too. He had that look some cops wear, like armor. I don't give up. Once the name arrived, the fear left. The seat setting stopped, feeling like trespass. and became instruction. If the seat crept forward, I eased off the accelerator and scanned for flecks in the gravel. If the cushion deepened, I braked and walked the ditch line. Paint told stories. So did a curled ribbon of composite lodged behind guardrail. I logged, bagged, and mailed. The lab confirmed. The road, at last, began to speak. The pattern I found was not fraud. It was adrenaline. A circle of illegal racers had been using the interstate during moonless hours and weather windows when the road felt empty and responsibility felt optional. Their cars were fast enough to erase mistakes, except the humankind. 5 of 7 incidents tied back through fragments and chat logs, through aftermarket catalogs and matching scrapes on undercarriage plates. The arrests were a fact. The relief, something else. New charges were filed in Hendriss's death. The paper said the case was closed. I knew better. Cases like his never close. They fade into the lives they repair. On the last day, I returned the rental in Louisville, signed a screen, and went back for my bag. The passenger seat had been moved again, but this time back to default. The way a good partner tidies a desk they won't be using anymore. I stood a moment longer than I needed to. You don't say thank you to a presence you can't prove. You feel it, the way the car had felt him, an adjustment and an absence that added up to guidance. I haven't seen him since. Still, on lonely stretches where the asphalt hums like a wire, I catch myself checking the right side, not because I'm afraid of who could be there, but because I hope. Justice is a long drive. It helps to have someone to point. Night in that part of Kentucky swallows sound. It turns overpasses into thresholds, each concrete rib like the vertebrae of something sleeping. I learned to watch the weather the way a fisherman reads tide charts. If the air cooled fast after rain, if mist pooled in the low median like breath caught in a throat, that's when they liked to run. Headlights strobing, engines held just under scream, scanners open to the highway patrol frequency. That was when the seat would inch forward, an unmistakable cue. I began to treat it as a yes-no question. Do we stop here? The fabric would dent. Do we stay moving? The seat would recede a notch. I don't claim communication. I claim coincidence with intent. Mine, and perhaps his, at one pull-off, where blackberry canes have learned the taste of antifreeze. I found a smear of blue on concrete. Not sky blue, work shirt blue, flecked with mica from a ceramic coating. The lab matched it to a trim piece available only for a certain model year. At another site, a snapped plastic Christmas tree clip lay half buried in dust. Aftermarket underbody cladding used by owners who wanted lift without attention. Connect enough trivia, and you get a map. The troopers were smart, and they were tired. They shared more than they had to, and I reciprocated. We built a schedule of nights the racers favored, cross-checked weather apps with tow invoices, subpoenaed a private tracks waiver list, and found the same names stuffing both worlds. I watched interrogation videos where bravado leaked out of a man's shoulders when shown a photo of a stranger's son. I carried 2 things on those drives: a camera and a name. The camera to prove what was there, the name to remind me why. I didn't speak it aloud. I didn't have to. Detective Michael Hendris rode with me in the way habits ride. They guide your hands without asking. The worst moment came midway through. At a site we hadn't tied to anything yet. There was a jacket button in the gravel. I pocketed it and planned to log it later. That night, in the motel, the seat belt on the passenger side lay latched, even though I hadn't touched it since noon. The air was too cold in the cabin. I sat in the driver's seat, palms on the wheel, and listened to the compressor cycle. If you are here, I thought, tell me what I'm missing. I don't pretend an answer came. But in the morning light, I looked again, farther down the shoulder, and found the skid's true origin point hidden under debris. The new line put the impact inside a curve the racers favored, when lanes were empty. The physics made sense. So did the timing stamp on a nearby warehouse camera. We requested the footage. The passenger shape was there again, a silhouette barely more than a darker darkness beside me. I didn't flinch this time. I nodded. Just once. The way you acknowledge a veteran showing you how to clear a room. It wasn't haunting. It was training. When the arrests came, they came in a cluster. A group chat seized. Location pings matching dashcam captures. A cracked front splitter that volunteered more testimony than its owner ever would. Families cried. Some shouted. The river took what it always takes. Everything offered, and everything dropped by hands not strong enough to hold it. The night after the arraignments, I drove the corridor one last time. I let the cruise control hover. Let old messages on the local AM station climb into static on hills. Let the moon nail the road to the earth like a silver tack. Mile marker by mile marker. I said nothing. The seat stayed still. When I parked at the airport hotel, I looked over. Default. That was the tell. The work, for now, was done. People think closure is a door. It isn't. It's a practice. You lay evidence down until its weight matches the weight of the loss. If you're lucky, the scale's steady. Back at headquarters, I filed things the way a person files grief. Precise. Labeled. Set where hands can find them quickly. My final report to the Kentucky State Police documented the line from paint to plate to person. The cadence of weather to meetup to impact. It named the illegal racing group, recommended coordination with prosecutors, and detailed how each fragment had been collected. With a partner I did not list, colleagues asked about Kentucky. I told them we did good work. They asked why I kept glancing to my right when I talked. I told them habit. Surveillance makes you paranoid. The truth sat in my chest like an uncashed check. I could have told them about the photos where the passenger seat seemed to hold a man-shaped negative. I could have told them about the videos where a figure lifted a quiet hand toward something I would later find. I could have, but I didn't. Some truths live better in the dark. On other cases now, far from I-75, I still note seat positions when I lock a car for the night. I still keep the AC a tick colder than comfort, just in case. And when the road opens ahead and the radio fades into the thrum of tires, I hear the shape of a lesson. Don't give up. Slow down. Look again. Not a voice. A method. There's a line investigators trade like a prayer. Every hit and run is someone's father, brother, son. It isn't pretty, but it keeps your boots on the shoulder when your bed is 3 counties away. He always said that every hit and run was someone's father or brother or son. If those were his words, they're mine now, too, stapled into my reflexes, alongside the way I check mirrors twice at night. Sometimes justice arrives in handcuffs. Sometimes it arrives as a seat sliding softly back, leaving you alone with your steering wheel and the knowledge that, for a while, the right side of your car was not empty. And if there are places where the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin, overpasses, perhaps where sound collects, then maybe that boundary isn't a wall at all. Maybe it's a patrol line, and those who kept it in life keep it still. If so, I hope they find their way to all of us who chase answers down long roads. I hope they ride shotgun and point. Story number 9. The first time a road folded time in front of me, I was aiming only for a postcard. The second time, I realized the road was aiming back. By the third, I learned to keep the lens steady and my breath quieter than the wind. On the fourth, the highway didn't just cross miles, it crossed centuries. This isn't a story about an image. It's about what an image can let in. I make a living hunting for the margins, those nameless pads of asphalt where someone once said, "Stop here," and most people never do. My archive is built of forgettable coordinates and unrepeatable light. My name is Adeline, and for years I have let a converted van stand in for a street address while I followed weather, elevation, and hunches from one latitude to another across the American West. I make my living as a travel photographer and blogger, documenting hidden gems, the kind of off-the-beaten path places a guidebook shrugs past. My companions are salt, dust, and the little ledger of notes where I sketch what a map can't. The coast that teaches me the most is Big Sur, the line where granite doesn't end but surrenders, where the horizon wears its weather like jewelry. I came that week to log highway pullouts, to test which shoulders offered the safest step to a view worth the breaking. It's the simple craft of the road, where to park, what direction to face, how the light will move across a given cliff between afternoon and dark, the kind of spots where you can park safely and capture the dramatic meeting of mountains and ocean, the places that make the Pacific Coast Highway one of the world's most scenic drives. I had driven that run countless times. Familiarity, though, never made it smaller. The sea was working itself into a steel blue calm. Far inland, the redwood scent threaded through chaparral. A hawk rode the thermals like the wind was a slow river. I wasn't chasing novelty so much as alignment, angle, weather, and a piece of land generous enough to become a story. The pullout found me at mile 31. It was a notch in the cliff, a modest room with a view, barely large enough for a handful of vehicles to exhale and a human to remember scale. It wasn't marked on any of my maps or praised by guidebooks, and yet it wore the quiet uniform of permission. Proper safety barriers, clean pavement, the state's polite nod. The view was spectacular in the unemphatic way Big Sur intends. Sea stacks shouldering tide, the highway riband along the escarpment, slopes wrestling with shadow. I dropped the rear door of the van and went to work. One camera set to RAW and JPEG, a wide angle to drink the panorama, a telephoto to pry loose the details, Note cards open for GPS, and access tips for readers who hike with their screens first. Solar panels had kept the batteries warm. I did the slow dance of tripod, gimbal, level, exposure. An hour's vocabulary I know by feel more than name. That's when screens began to disagree about the present. On the camera's back. The JPEG previews were the day I was standing in. Modern highway, contemporary guardrails, recent model cars easing by in patient chains. Everything sensible, everything accounted for. But on the laptop, the place I check my RAW files, the same frames reported something else. The road was there, but narrower. The pavement was tired, in a way asphalt now rarely looks. The metal at the edge had a simpler shape, like it wasn't fully convinced people meant to live forever. And the cars, they were lang and low and sugared with chrome. The daydreams of the 1960s and 70s, not the aerodynamic apologies we build now. The Overlook's dress code had changed too. Wooden rails where the modern cliff wore steel and concrete. Brush growing as if no ranger had ever carried clippers. Then there were the people. At first, I thought I had framed a reflection from somewhere behind me, but there was no behind. Only the cliff I stood on, the lunging space, and the ocean below. Still, the files offered bodies that hadn't been sharing air with me a heartbeat earlier. A mother herding children, a father raising a boxy camera, not at the coast, but straight at me. A girl in a bright scarf, skirt tethered with a knot of fingers, looking through my lens and right past it, like a person reading a window. I did the sensible things. I swapped cards. I changed bodies. I bracketed exposures and abused batteries. Different memory cards, different camera settings, even a different camera body. The outcome didn't budge. The JPEG files showed the present, tidy and current. The RAW files kept capturing the same location at different points in the past. No ghosting, no double exposure. Shadows fell where the sun required, and every element obeyed the same hour. I stayed because leaving would have been a confession I wasn't ready to make. The sun sank into the habits it reserves for the Pacific. Low, slow, lucid. In the raws, the world layered itself. Not like an accident, but like sediment. Older road alignments, where later crews had straightened a dangerous elbow. A low visitor facility, where now there was scraped earth. A tiny restaurant, or gift shop, holding the wind at bay. Windows bright with afternoon, and the faces began to behave as if photographed. Families knitted closer. Children leaned into each other in that posture of performance we all learn on vacations. Some of them waved. I didn't wave back. I focused. But when I looked away from the camera, toward the reasonable overlook at my feet, the parking slots were empty, and the air held only wind. The frames reached a strange harmony. Modern guardrails in the foreground, vintage cars sliding by on a narrower highway, contemporary safety barriers guarding visitors dressed in 1970s fabrics. It didn't read like collage, it read like agreement. Time wasn't arguing with itself. It was collaborating. Then the cliff opened deeper. Men in 1930s work clothes stood on raw ledges, coaxing an artery out of granite. Early 1940s and 50s, tourists idled in big-shouldered sedans, windows down. One arm hung out to learn the temperature of a century. There was a sequence, that felt like an intermission in joy. World War II watchfulness, when the coast wore the posture of surveillance and civilians were kept away by a seriousness you could almost touch. Past that, the road was gone. Trails stitched the slopes where the highway would someday lie. People moved with a practiced ease to the rhythm of the coast. Native American communities who knew this stretch of cliff long before deeds and departments. I watched them fish from rocks that later grading had resculpted, watched lines of travel that answered only to contour and season, not to asphalt's insistence. There was no romance in those frames, only competence, only a long conversation between human intention and weather. When the sun's coin slid into the ocean and the light thinned to a kind of permission, I folded the tripod and went still. I had the feeling that if I breathed wrong, I'd erase an hour. I drove to a campsite because a body needs a place to put itself. Opened the laptop because a photographer believes in verification, and discovered that verification was temporary. The past, it turns out, is courteous, but not generous. Details thinned every time I looked. Shirts losing their patterns, rails losing their grain, colors recalibrated to the palette of now. Faces withdrew, like a tide you didn't notice turning until your feet went dry. Within days, frames that had held the elbow of an older road now showed only the straightened present. And where a gift shop had impressed itself on light, there was only the brush I had seen with my eyes at all but one. It's a photograph whose math shouldn't work. The overlook is exactly as it is now. Fresh railing, clean signage, modern lines. In front of it stands a family from the 1960s, and they are waving at me. Their faces aren't wary. Their faces are the kind that never expect to see themselves in a museum and don't want to. The image is technically perfect, with no signs of manipulation, which is to say the file obeys rules, while the world inside it does not. I keep it rolled in felt in a drawer that doesn't pretend to be anything but a drawer. I didn't publish it. I've never posted that photograph to my blog because I already know the comment section it would summon, and because I don't want to give this particular strangeness to the appetite of the internet. Some images are products, some are instructions. That one tells me, pay closer attention to places that feel heavier than they look. I went back. Of course I went back. I returned to the same overlook 3 more times, choosing the same hour, hunting the same alignment of haze and sun, repeating the ritual, because repetition is sometimes the only door we have. Other photographers I spoke with had never experienced anything similar. The guidebooks were proper and incurious. The map was a bright abstraction. The cliff stood in the only mood it owes anybody, its own. If you want a thesis, I have one now. Some overlooks are more than places to look down. They are apertures, holes in the fabric. A landscape will sometimes hold open when conditions rhyme. Stand on the right seam of light with a device designed to trap fractions, and reality, usually so busy with sequence, may show you parallel. On an afternoon in August 2021, mile 31 became such a scene. The overlook at mile marker 31 looks like just another scenic pullout along the Pacific Coast Highway. That sentence is as true today as it was the week I learned better. Most afternoons, it is merely a safe place to stop and measure yourself against a big edge. On others, I have evidence for at least one. The cliff remembers too much to be quiet about it. I still drive the same routes. I still park on anonymous asphalt and watch how the air arranges itself over water. Now, though, I pay attention to weight, the faint hush that doesn't match the wind, the particular salt of the air, the way a shadow arrives a breath before the thing that casts it. Those are the tells. Those are the manners of a place with a memory. When the light goes coin-god and the edges soften, I lift the camera, not to summon the past, but to leave room for it. I focus at the rail, then at the road, then at the horizon that pretends to be a line. I hold my breath, not out of fear, but out of respect. If the world wants to be more than one thing at once, the least I can do is make the frame wide enough. The family in the felt-lined drawer will stay there, not as a secret, exactly, and not as proof. As a reminder that the past is not behind us. It is beside us, occasionally within reach. And sometimes, if the cliff decides it counts you as careful, it will wave back. Story number 10. I used to believe roads were promises, lines drawn across the land that always kept their word. I used to believe time obeyed clocks. I used to believe love could pull you home the way a magnet finds true north. On a Friday in September 2019, I learned that faith can be a cul-de-sac, and on the last 5 miles, I learned how to let go. My name is Apollo, and at 67 years old, I had a map in my bones. From my small apartment in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, every other week, I'd steer my old pickup toward the place I called proof that life still had weight and warmth. My daughter's house and the riot of Emma and Jacob tumbling toward the door. The route is simple and familiar, or so I had believed. Just 93 miles across the quilt of fields where corn and soy take turns dressing the hills. I've made this trip hundreds of times in my old Ford pickup truck. The ritual steadied me after Helen's funeral, after the long, unstructured days, after the silence learned all my rooms by heart, always taking Highway 151 past small towns with cafe windows that fog in winter and creak open to summer. Then the familiar swing to Highway 20, that last ribbon toward supper and stories. My hands knew those curves, the way a letter carrier learns porches and dogs, and the exact weight of a morning's mail. I had been a postman long enough to understand that routes are really prayers in plain clothes. That Friday, I left on time. Coffee in a stainless mug that still smelled faintly of yesterday. The radio offered old country ballads without apology, and I let them play like a porch light you never switch off. The afternoon sun turned the fields to hammered brass. Farmhouses kept their quiet company with windbreaks. Silos lifted like exclamation points, and along a fence, a red barn flashed the ghost of an advertisement older than my pension. In that light, the world felt repaired and ready to be trusted. I had baked that morning, the kind of steady work that makes a kitchen remember its purpose. Oatmeal cookies cooled on wax paper as if lined up for inspection. I stacked them in a cooler, tucked a note beneath the lid for Emma. "I'm proud of you already." And one for Jacob. "Play that song for me, even if you think it isn't perfect." Little rituals, the postage of affection. 5 miles to go, I told myself, and felt the gentle lift of arrival in my chest. The way your breath lightens when you see a porch light through trees. Only those 5 miles did not pass. The road took on the blank patience of a hallway in a hospital. I waited for the water tower that should have greeted me, for the low parade of dealerships where machines squat like cattle with chrome hides. No tower, no lots. The horizon shrugged and handed me more of the same. The odometer kept its counsel. My digital clock read 4:15 p.m. and did not negotiate. When confusion is young, it is quiet. You clear your throat, change lanes, pretend the world merely needs a better angle. I pulled into a gas station stamped from a template I'd seen 100 times. Bright canopy, lonely squeegee, a rack of windshield wipers. No one will buy until they must. Inside, a white shirt attendant folded a newspaper he had not been reading. He had a kindly face, the sort that would look at home behind a church coffee urn. Which way to Dub? The syllable felt wrong in my mouth. Dubuque lives in the voice, the way a name lives in a wedding vow. Which way to Dubuque? I don't know that one, he said, careful but firm, as if refusing a counterfeit bill. I tried again. Cascade? Dyerville? He shook his head, as though I had listed towns in a dream. My hands rested on the counter, heavy in a way that made me want to apologize to my wrists. Back in the cab, I studied the fuel gauge. A perfect half, as if time had not been drinking. Bars of cell signal glowed full, and every call attempt slid sideways. Numbers not in service. Lines busied by what I could not hear. The air in the cab took on a museum hush. I pulled back onto the highway, because movement sometimes impersonates hope. The sun held its place with disciplined generosity. That same late afternoon gold that photographers chase and farmers work beneath. It did not sink. It hovered. I drove with the steady hands I had practiced for decades. Winter routes on ice, summer roads with tar soft enough to remember your souls. The speedometer formed its patient arc. The tires sang their threadless hymn, quiet, constant, insisting that physics still had a job. Then I saw them. A blue Buick keeping the inside lane as if it hid a secret. A work truck with a man glancing down at a watch that no longer wanted to help. A minivan with the shadow play of children beyond the glass. Each vehicle was its own terrarium of worry. I lifted my palm. Eyes met mine. Mouths moved. No sound crossed the inches between us. We were an orchestra after the conductor has left, each player reading a different bar, each insisting the piece continues. I passed the red barn again, the church with the high steeple again, the crossroads where my muscles should have relaxed. That familiar left-right, left the body remembers, even if the mind is lost in a song. I knew then that I was not lost in the practical way a person can be lost. There was a deeper grammar at work, a clause I could not diagram. It takes a lifetime to curate the drawer, where you hide truths you do not wish to pay taxes on. Mine had grown crowded. The chest pains that nagged like an overlooked bill. The cardiology appointment I postponed because I did not want to sit under fluorescent lights and hear words arranged into a sentence I could not disobey. The days when breathing felt like a job with no holidays, I pulled to the shoulder and let the engine idle. The corn rows rippled like a congregation standing to sing. In their ordered lines, I recognized my old roots. The faithful plod from house to house, the way addresses teach you both the geography of a town and the weather report of its marriages. There are porches you linger on. There are doors you learn not to knock twice. For 42 years, I had carried envelopes and small packages, apologies and threats, college acceptance letters and foreclosure warnings, all the paperwork of being human. We think the mail is neutral. It is not. It is a courier of weather. I rested my forehead on the wheel and felt how close my heartbeat lived to the bone. I did not want to remember the sway, the slide of tire into shoulder, the moment a routine trip decides to improvise. Memory arrived anyway, selective and stubborn, the way the horizon tilted, how gravel had a different voice under the tread, the flare of white that might have been airbag, might have been sky. I looked up, and the road lay ahead, with the same untroubled certainty as before. The sun kept its post. 4:15 stared back. The loop had the kindness to leave the light on, but lacked the mercy to open any doors. I thought of Helen. In the late years, we were a quiet duet, the sort that no longer needs to rehearse. She would hum in the kitchen while I stacked rubber-banded bundles of circulars and petitions. The night before her surgery, she held my hand and said, "Promise me you'll keep living like you deliver good news." Grief rewrites a promise until you cannot recognize your own signature. I had been keeping the shape of a life, the visits, the cookies, the radio, without always stepping into its meaning. The highway offered its same arithmetic: fences, field, pasture, silo, repeat, a comfort pattern, a lullaby for a man who feared the end of the song. If this was a trap, it was built from everything I loved. That is how the kindest prisons work, so I tried to test it. I counted mile markers aloud. I fixed my gaze on a distant cottonwood and promised I would not blink until I reached it. I rolled down the window and named clouds after the grandchildren. Emma, with her careful questions. Jacob, with his small, proud flair after any triumph. The wind braided my hair the way Helen used to in the kitchen, laughing that an old postman still liked to be fussed over. The cottonwood refused to hurry. The mile markers narrated nothing. The loop tightened, not like a noose, but like an embrace I was reluctant to release. I knew the work I had to do. And it was not about directions. The endless highway wasn't a supernatural trap or a glitch in reality. It was an act of gentleness from a mind that had spent 6 decades delivering things intact. My life had been logistics and care. No creased corners, no wet envelopes. My mind was padding the porcelain, cushioning the fragile, keeping me from the full weight of a truth I had postponed like junk mail. I pulled over again and turned off the engine. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of attention. In that silence, I felt a trembling begin to resolve into gratitude. The road had formed a cradle. It was not withholding my destination. It was waiting for me to accept a new one. I spoke aloud, because sometimes the air must hear you confess. "I understand," I said. "I'm listening," the field answered, with its ordinary choreography. Far off, a combine moved in patient geometry. Above, a hawk worked circles, like a compass, teaching itself forgiveness. I thought of the Amana colonies, and their insistence that community is an act you renew every day. I had been renewing mine with mileage. Now I had to renew it with surrender. I took the cooler from the passenger seat and set it on my lap. The ice packs sweated. I lifted the lid and breathed the sweet that ovens make when they have more to say. I ate one cookie as if accepting communion, closing my eyes at the cinnamon's small sermon. When I looked again, the road was the same and different, the way a loved one's face looks after you speak the words they have been carrying for you. Across the median, the blue Buick settled on the shoulder. The woman inside wore the uniform of the Midwest, floral blouse, practical hair, eyes that have watched too many seasons to be surprised. She looked at me and raised the palm of her hand, a blessing disguised as a wave. In the minivan, a child pressed a paper against glass, crayon loops of a house under a sun that refused to set. The man in the work truck took off his cap and bowed his head. We were pilgrims at a very plain shrine. I set the cooler back and reached for the column shifter. The choice, I realized, was mine. I could complete the ritual and re-enter the loop, or I could leave through the only exit available, the one that refused visible signage. There are intersections with no arrows and no painted lanes. You proceed because something in you has finished a sentence. I eased onto the road, and the pavement accepted me without surprise. The horizon began to tilt. Not with the unease of accident, but with the grace of a drawing corrected by a careful hand. The highway began to change, letting go of its repetition, offering curves that belonged to no memory I carried. Trees thickened, fences thinned, the light deepened into a color that had no name I could put on paper. I understood then that I had not failed to arrive. I had been given a threshold long enough to set down my bag. I spoke to Helen the way you speak to someone in a neighboring room. "I'm on my way," I said. "I'm not late. I'm simply done measuring time. And because love is not jealous, I spoke to the living as well. Sarah, teach them the names of the birds. Tell Emma that courage tastes like the first bite after a long fast. Tell Jacob that practice is a form of love. Tell them I kept the road company as long as I could." The pickup hummed, as if pleased to be unnecessary. We had carried each other through storms. We could part without an argument. Ahead, a scatter of distant lights arranged themselves into a welcome that refused to specify its street address. Porch light, hospital monitor, the glow behind a bedroom door where a child listens for the familiar, tired engine, and the knock that means stories. I did not need to decide which they were. I needed only to be brave enough to reach them. People imagine the end as spectacle, but I think it is inventory. You decide what fits in the satchel and what you lay down. I kept Helen's laugh, the one that arrived before the joke learned to walk. I kept the way snow softens a mailbox until the morning looks like a postcard sent to itself. I kept the porch in July, where Sarah told us she was expecting, and Helen cried into potato salad because joy has poor table manners. I kept the dignity of small towns that refuse to hurry their Sundays. I kept the discipline of showing up and the relief of being known. I set down the ache of postponement. I set down the kitchen light I switched on for no one. I set down the argument with my body and the stubbornness that made a calendar into a shield. I set down the idea that love guarantees safe passage. Love offers companionship, not immunity. If a life can be summarized on a route map, mine would be this. Start at home, proceed through work, collect names, protect packages, refuse to gossip about the contents, accept weather, return. The last leg adds one more instruction. When the map ends, keep walking until the ground becomes a bridge. On the shoulder, Queen Anne's lace lifted its delicate plaits as if expecting visitors. Grasshoppers made the kind of sudden movements that keep hawks honest. Far off, a train offered a line of motion that did not require me anymore. The world continued with its unembarrassed chores. I felt no grievance. It was a comfort to know the corn would tassel without my supervision. For a moment, I imagined Emma holding the school project about Iowa she wanted to show me. The careful glue, the way children arrange facts like gifts. I imagined Jacob raising his recorder, breath caught between nerves and pride. The thin melody, bold enough to enter a room full of adults and announce itself a song. I had wanted to clap at the right moments and tease him into an encore. I still could. If not with hands, then with a memory that would not dampen. Grief is a letter addressed to a house that keeps being renovated. I could not ensure delivery. I could only trust that what I had mailed for decades, the habit of showing up, the refusal to withhold tenderness, would arrive in them as muscle memory. The horizon promised reunion, not as spectacle, but as a familiar lamp behind a curtain. The loop of familiar highway faded away, taking with it the comfort of pretending I could postpone this final journey. I was not being erased. I was being forwarded. I turned off at a road that had not existed until I needed it. That is the mercy of thresholds. They wait until we are ready to see them. The pavement became a narrow lane edged with milkweed and unafraid of its own quiet. I slowed not from caution, but gratitude. I used to tell new carriers, the bag will feel its heaviest before your body learns it. After that, you will not be stronger. You will be accustomed. I had been accustomed to carrying myself. It was time to be carried. I put the truck in drive and headed toward those distant lights, and the air changed the way a house does when someone you love steps onto the porch. I did not look in the rear view. The past does not ask for eye contact at this stage. Instead, I kept my eyes forward and my hands relaxed. And for the first time all day, the word destination did not sound like an assignment. The road narrowed again, then broadened without marking the transition. Trees folded toward me like a congregation leaning in to hear the benediction. Here and there, mailboxes stood with their small, determined flags, and I smiled at the thought that somewhere a carrier I had never trained was making a promise to a neighborhood with every step. At a bend, I saw a figure ahead, a woman in a summer dress that remembered breezes. Her posture had the mild authority of someone who had solved the daily crossword without telling anyone. She turned, and the late light did what it always does when it finds the right face. It forgave the day for being ordinary. Helen, not younger, not older. Exact. I did not stop the truck out of fear it would vanish. I stopped because arrivals deserve ceremony. I stepped down, and my knees behaved like friends. When she took my hand, the road belonged to us the way a kitchen does at midnight, when the conversation has wandered past topics and into truth. "You were stubborn," she said, amused and tender. "I had deliveries," I said. "You still do," she answered. "Just a different route." Behind us, the pickup rested with the satisfied tilt of a tool that has done its work and does not envy the next one. I thought of postal workers who spent their lives delivering messages, of grandparents measuring their wealth in the laughter of children, and I felt the ease that arrives when a sentence ends exactly where it should. The lights ahead arranged themselves into something like a street, something like a shoreline, something like the aisle of a church that refuses to ask which faith you brought. We walked. The air held the sweetness of fresh bread and cut hay, the clean edge of rain not yet here. I did not wonder what would happen next. I had done my wondering. I had my address somewhere, in a house with a porch I could draw from memory. A grandfather did not arrive at 4:15. Somewhere, a pot roast cooled and was saved for tomorrow. Somewhere. Emma placed her project on the table and asked questions about rivers and treaties, and why towns change their names. And Jacob played his song for a room that clapped too early, and then again, just to get it right. Grief would learn the house, then learn the family, then begin to unpack. Love would refuse to leave. I had not failed them. I had simply used the last of my miles to make sure the road itself would remember their names. We walked toward the lights until walking no longer required feet. The night, when it finally arrived, did not fall. It opened. Story number 11. Rain braided the highway into silver threads, and I followed them like a tired moth chasing a porch light. Deadlines stalked my calendar, but the road hunted me harder, folding mile after mile into a single blurred corridor. When the green sign rose from the rain like a fresh-cut leaf, I felt a tug I could not name. I had maps, I had metrics, I had meetings in the morning, and none of it explained the throb of recognition in my chest. I touched the wheel, blinked through the mist, and let a small decision tilt the rest of my life. My name is Piper, and I work in marketing for a tech company based in Boston. The kind of role that turns travel into routine, and routine into a quiet erosion you barely notice. Clients across New England, numbers to move, presentations to carry like fragile glass. Providence had gone poorly. My pitch met a wall of caution and nostalgia masquerading as prudence. The radio murmured useless traffic updates, and my rental's navigation sketched red across the interstate in a band that promised delay. I was a few exits from the place I normally fled to after bad nights. Home, with its soft lamp in the kitchen and the dependable ache of a plant I kept forgetting to water. The rain deepened. Headlights smeared into ribbons. My windshield cleared in beats that never kept pace. Then the sign, Exit 13, Millfield. I knew that corridor. I had memorized its food stops and gas prices, its weathered markers, and the places where cops liked to lurk. There was no Exit 13 on this stretch, yet the sign shone like new paint. The unit on my dash chimed in a voice trained for authority, advising the turn to avoid an accident ahead. Detour time minimal. I took Exit 13 off Interstate 495 and drove straight into 1953. Down the ramp, The world shed its gloss. The street lamps wore a gentle amber halo. Their heads were older, the glass thick, the light warm, the shadows careful. Signs pressed white on black in tidy letters from another alphabet of design. A filling station squatted at the bend. White cladding, red trim, big windows, pumps topped with glass crowns announcing lineage. Prices belonged to a ledger no longer in circulation. The banner promised Ethel premium, like a miracle of chemistry. The parking area was filled with cars that belonged in a museum. Rounded fenders, heavy chrome, white wall arcs precise as freshly chalked lines. A blue Chevrolet with a grin of grille. A cream Buick that suggested Sunday drives on careful roads. A black pickup waiting as if the century hadn't moved. I tried to wrench meaning from it all. Theme town, reenactment, an enthusiast's enclave. I had seen nostalgia polished until it gleamed and sold like candy. But this was not set dressing. It was environment. The deeper I went, the tighter the stitch. The theater marquee offered from here to eternity and Roman holiday. Dress windows staged full skirts and corsets of the hourglass religion. The men's shop praised wash and wear, as if permanence had finally arrived. People flowed past in cut and cloth, obedient to a different decade. Not performing, but inhabiting. The way fish don't perform water. Hunger and curiosity drove me into a diner, lit like memory. Red booths, checkerboard tile, a counter lined with chrome. Music threaded the air from a box that looked like a jukebox should. The waitress wore pink with a clean white apron and a name pin that read Betty, as if you had written comfort and someone translated it into a person. I asked for coffee and something simple to steady my hands. Prices floated like misprints. A dinner for less than $2 read like a dare. Betty's expression softened around my confusion. The world tilted again when I tried to pay. "We only take cash or check," she said, kind as a teacher with a puzzled student. Her gaze flicked to the card in my hand, as if it were a thin, metal insect. I counted bills and quarters that suddenly felt like artifacts. They were not. They were new as rain, only born to an older treasury. I listened. The talk at the booths carried names and worries that should have been relegated to archived broadcasts. A president they approved of. It's Wednesday, October 15th. A television show adored across living rooms, humming with tubes. A high school football rivalry that could scar a season. Newspapers by the door sat stacked in neat columns, their dates and headlines aligned with a calendar I had only studied. I told Betty, gently at first, then with more insistence, what I believed to be true. That I had come from 2020. That my map lived in satellites. That my professional currency existed on screens. She placed a hand near mine and spoke in the same careful cadence people use when storms move in and a stranger needs shelter. Maybe rest would lift the fog. Maybe work had stretched my sense of time into something unreliable. 2 hours bled into the walls. The coffee steadied me. The pie reminded me of a kitchen that never existed for me except in secondhand stories. The evidence never bent. Coins rang with old dates. A phone in a corner waited for a nickel and a rotary turn. News from the radio narrated a world with different borders. I told myself that the world sometimes plays games with the exhausted, that rain is good at inventing reflections. That explanation survived until I stepped into air cold enough to clean a mind and found my car unwilling to answer the key. Betty stepped out from the neon wash with the composure of someone practiced in solutions. She offered a name, Harold, a husband with hands that understood engines. He arrived not long after, a man in coveralls, a cap devoted to an oil brand that lived now only in antique shops. He examined the tangle under my hood with the patience of a reader of strange languages. He admitted confusion without embarrassment. He recommended the wisdom of time. Mourning might soften the problem. There was compassion in that suggestion, but also a pressure like a hand at the base of my neck, as if the town preferred residents to guests. Mourning was not an option. A meeting had its teeth in my calendar. But urgency was not the only pressure. A sensation had crept over me in that booth and thickened by the curb, that the town had a tide, that if I slept here, I would wake under its gravity. I turned the key with a prayer I would not have admitted to owning. The car responded as if the first attempt had never occurred. Harold looked pleased in a way that honored the mystery rather than claimed the credit. I thanked them both with money that felt like play and consequence at once, and I pointed the hood toward the ramp that rose like a lifeline. The ascent unwound the spell in increments. In the rear view, the modest geometry of the town receded. The lamps cooled to darker dots. The ramp lifted me above the trees. The unit on my dash issued news of cleared lanes, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Back on the interstate, the traffic thinned. White markers returned to their modern glare. The road became the road again. I went home and did what people do now when faced with anomalies. I searched. The town did not exist on any map I could call up. The exit did not exist. According to the agency that builds and numbers these veins of concrete, there is no exit 13 on that stretch of interstate. A voice told me through a phone line after a brief wait on hold. Plans had once sketched such a ramp, and then budgets and environmental concerns erased them. The space where the road would have met the highway found a second life as trees and soil and the careful silence of preservation. I drove that corridor again and again in the months that followed, always at reasonable hours, then at unreasonable ones. Rain helped recall the mood. Fatigue helped recall the error. Once or twice, a reflection hinted at amber where none should be. Once or twice, music threaded through static with an old crooner's steadiness. I turned my head to fix the signal with sight, and each time found only forest and lane and the certainty of paint. I tell this now because memory becomes story when you look at it long enough, and because I fear that forgetting would be its own trap, the kind that lets a town keep what it takes. I have learned to respect the exits I know, and to distrust the ones that gleam too new in places that should be familiar. I drive more slowly when rain veils the shoulder. I check my clock. I check the lower corner of my windshield, where inspection stickers live. I listen for the quiet shape of music that belonged to grandparents, and a country that believed newness could be permanent. And if I pass that corridor late, and the air smells like wet leaves and ozone, I do not look for exit 13. I do not need to. The road remembers me. The past does not need my permission to open.